Are we good? All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out this morning and returning. Looks like most of you have come back from last night, so I won't give too much of a recap. I'll save Dr. Bookman all the time he can have to continue with his second session on the Passion Week of Christ as he walked us through the humanity of Christ and emphasized the importance with that, and then bringing us up, giving us some context and leading up to the events of the Passion Week with the triumphal entry. I'm thankful for Dr. Bookman and his ministry. I've learned much from him through the years. I've benefited from your YouTube channel during the pandemic when it broke out. You were teaching online, and that was very enjoyable. So I would encourage you to check out his stuff on YouTube and the website he mentioned yesterday as well. That would be jdbookmanministries.com, I believe. Well, I remember when I was in Israel, I had the privilege of traveling with Dr. Bookman, with Josh DeLeon and Bailey as well, and Pastor Dave here. And I never met Dr. Bookman beforehand, and one of my impressions of him as we were traveling, and I was gleaning all this information and just writing down as fast as I could as he's lecturing and as we're walking the sites of Israel. I remember being on, it was the mountain west of Galilee, Arbel, thank you. And we were making our way down, and it was like this gorge, rocky, kind of like tedious pass that you had to walk down. And I'm like, how is this old guy going to get down there? This is really kind of technical kind of descend, and yet without hesitation and very agile as much as any of us, down he went, and we followed him, and it was a great time. I benefited greatly from his teaching and insights into the Word. So I'm going to turn it over to him as he continues to faithfully expose and reveal the person and work of Christ to us.
And let me just say, not infrequently, I had that same thought. How's this old guy going to get down there, for heaven's sakes? But I can just go over it. Now listen, I mentioned to you last night, and I got thank you so much for Rory for setting this up for me. But this is that website, and I'm just the only reason I have you here. You get there by jdbookmanministries.com, and can you see up here in the right-hand corner? There's a word that says links. So if you click on that, I do this because I want everybody to know about my really big muscled-up website, right? No, there's nothing to this website. But just to have a way to electronically get you to that Dropbox. So if you go there, hit links, one of the links it'll take you to is here, resources on the life of Christ, occasionally updated. Now, where that will take you is to a Dropbox. I'm gonna walk you through this just real quickly. And again, I forgive the hubris to whatever degree it's there, but I am jealous for you to understand the life of Jesus, and I think you will find it as soul refreshing as anything you've ever done to get closer and closer to understand the life Jesus lived. And this should open up into a Dropbox link. It's being very, very slow. I don't know exactly why. But let me just tell you that Dropbox link, if you open any document or whatever in Dropbox, it's clunky. You can move it around, so what you want to do, it won't open for me, is go to download, and then it'll download as a document, and you can save it. I absolutely no, for what it's worth, proprietary impulse. You don't have to worry about it. You're not taking anything from me. Put it to any use you can. Share it. But I will just show you, here is the actual Dropbox. And that's what it'll look like. You can't see that very well, but there's a lot of, even those, listen, that was the weirdest thing. When we all went into temporary forced hibernation, and had no idea what was going on. Remember back then where we really didn't know? Now the fact that we know it now, we keep it up, is a different thing. But the fact that we're well into fool me twice territory, I keep saying. But on the other hand, so my daughter said, a lot of people are just going online and doing things. Why don't you do something? I never heard of Facebook Live. I didn't know it existed, and I perpetually demonstrated how unfamiliar I was with it as I went through it. But all of that's there, and others who have, they'd appreciate it, and they could help you as well. Again, it has Please don't think of it as having anything to do with me. What the issue is, and I'll tell you something, by reason of the fact, I mentioned this yesterday, I don't want to get into it, this is seminary stuff, but not that you can't handle seminary stuff, but we're doing Life of Christ. But by reason of the fact that the whole evangelical world has bought an understanding of the Gospels that removes their eyewitness character and that questions their absolute historical reliability, people don't study the life of Jesus. Very important scholars whose name you might well recognize. I don't know how I moved the accent there, but scholars, with good standing argue that there's no use trying to reconstruct the life of Jesus. It just can't be done. Just look at an individual pericope, event, passage, and so on, but don't try and relate them one to another. Well, you're not going to have anything even approximately a life if you don't do that. And just very quickly, the reason is because they will argue that the broad stories and the teaching is true, but the narrative and especially the details on the margin, I call it, you can't trust those. That's what you need to harmonize. Makes sense to you? In other words, it's when you see these little connections that are clear, that's how you harmonize. But if you don't believe those are dependable, you're not going to harmonize. And so I'm making a point that the evangelical world, okay, I'm an old guy. When I was in seminary, or even, I don't know, through the early years of my ministry, it seemed like every 2 or 3 years, a major life of Christ, a book tracing the life of Christ would appear. Some scholar would have, and we'd kick it around and compare it and so on. I don't think there's been one for 30 years, honest to goodness. There are studies in the life of Christ that turn out to be synoptic studies and so on, but all right, so enough of that. All right, let me take you then, that's not helping. Let me take you back to our PowerPoint, and I'll start right here. This is the outline we're going to use, and let me just rehearse very quickly. I appreciate I kept you up late last night, and here you are early this morning, but just very quickly, you remember that I like to think of Sunday as a day of messianic presentation. Now, there are 2 Sundays. The Passion Week, have you ever thought about this? Why do we call it the Passion? Is that intuitive to you? It might be the more so if you were raised on the King James. How many of you read the King James and are man enough to admit it, I like to say. But yeah, I love the King James. I know. But at any rate, I think the reason that in the English-speaking world we've come to refer to the events around Jesus' death and resurrection and so on is because of the King James translation of Acts 1, where Dr. Luke says that Jesus showed himself alive after his passion. You remember that? And it's a good translation. Most modern translations don't use that term there, after his suffering it'll have, or after his agony. But the old King James used the word passion, and out of that, I think, has come as almost universal, I don't know, use of the word passion to refer to the events of Jesus' suffering. And the week that tells that story is referred to as the Passion Week, as you know. And, if there are dramas telling us the Passion Play and so on. But what I was going to say is that the Passion Week is an 8-day week. And if it were not, we wouldn't be here today. That makes sense to you? So there's the first Sunday, and then there is of course, Resurrection Sunday. So the first Sunday, Triumphal Entry, Palm Sunday, we're referring to as a day of messianic presentation. And again, the scene was set, and I didn't drive this home very carefully, but I want to take just a moment. Remember, we started last night by looking at that passage in Luke 13 where Jesus in Prairie, in response to those Pharisees who come over with their cheap little trick, trying to lure Jesus back into Judea. Remember, Judea, Pilate, The Jews can make him do what they want. Perea, Antipas, they got no leverage there. So they're trying to get him out of there. I want to do something. I don't know. But let me take you to that passage, because Luke 13, I'm going to go back to it. Oh, well, nuts. I started to open this and forgot. Hold on. I'm going to open my Bible. I forgot. So if you go to Luke 13, you know, I will make this point again and again, that I said last night, it's so important to read the Bible in terms of its own culture. The Bible is not a culture-bound book. It will work in any culture. It is a culture-based book. It's based in a culture which is very different than ours. And it's history, it's real history, and history plays out in the midst of a people and a place and a geography and so on. So you have to understand, I mean, you're going to be hugely advantaged, and the black and white story is going to become technicolor to you, to the degree that you really begin to ponder it from its own culture. And it's a fun culture. There's so many, but one of the things I like to point out here, now let me just check. In Luke 13 and verse 31, you have this story of the Pharisees. Now, I'm jumping back here, forgive me, shame on me, but of the Pharisees when they, is that big enough? Can you see that? Can you handle that? Because I can make it bigger. But this is what he says in the red here. He says, go tell that fox. And then he says, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow and the third day. Well, the third day I'll be perfected. Then he says, nevertheless, I'm going to journey today, tomorrow, and the day following. And commentators, quite frankly, look at that and they say, we don't have any idea what he's talking about, because we don't know about his day-by-day schedule to have any idea what he's talking about. And it was certainly more than 3 days later that he made his way over there to raise Lazarus from the dead. That's the next thing that happens after this. Listen, the New Testament writers, oh, here's another hobby horse number. It's high on the list. I think it's 4 or 5. The New Testament writers wrote in Greek. They thought in Hebrew. They think Old Testament thoughts. The best way to understand the New Testament is to saturate your mind with the Old Testament in every way. And the Old Testament, here's another little curiosity, I'm going to get to work. The Bible was written for an oral culture. In other words, it was written to be read aloud. Most people didn't have, people get after, in antiquity, people were illiterate and so on. Well, in a lot of cases they were, but it was because there was hardly anything in life more expensive than a book, for heaven's sake. You didn't have any books. You had to go and listen to it being read. That's how you learned. And they had an amazing capacity in an oral culture. I like to say that you could take a guy off the docks of Caesarea Maritima from Jesus' day, and if you could bring him whole here, he'd make a huge pile of money as a performer in nightclubs and so on, doing feats of human memory that we would regard as superhuman. And he'd say, what are you talking about? Honest to goodness. That's just how they learned. Now, having said it, because it's an oral culture, think about this. The author of the text who's telling a story has to build into the words on the page whatever he wants of nuance, of emphasis, of question, everything he wants. He can't, there are no punctuation marks. And besides, you can't depend on the inflection of the reader. He may get it wrong. So everything has to be built in, and Hebrew especially. Greek is not so much, but Hebrew has the most amazing panoply or catalog of literary devices and clever ways, and one of them is called because I'm asking, what does Jesus mean when he says to those Pharisees, I'm going to walk today and tomorrow, and on the third day, I'll be perfected? What do you mean by that? Well, one of the ways in which Hebrew now this is Greek, but Jesus is, his mind, if you don't mind, snores in Hebrew. I don't know, but I made that part up, obviously. I don't know if he snored or not, but I'm saying that the Hebrew Bible just came out of every pore. And so he thinks in Hebrew categories. And the fact is, there is a means of emphasizing usually completeness. Something comes to fullness. in the Hebrew called the, are you ready for this? The numerical progression. Never heard of that? Ah, but you have. Finish this for me. 6 things the Lord hates. What? Talk to me. Yea, 7 are an abomination. 3 things I don't understand. Yea, 4 are more than I can comprehend. For 2 transgressions of Moab, yea, for 3. Now, the numbers are not important, and it certainly doesn't mean that God only hates those 7 things. It means he really hates these 7 things. It doesn't mean that these are the only sins Moab committed, but they filled up their cup. You know what I'm saying? So it's fullness. So what is Jesus saying? Everybody would have understood what he's saying. What he is saying is, I'm not going to fall for your little trick. I'm going to, today, tomorrow, and on the 3rd day. In other words, when the time is full. I will come when the time is full. Does that make sense to you? And again, there are just all sorts of ways that bring the Old Testament with you. But learn the culture. All right, Rory, I'm going to take a minute. One other thing. This is just a thing with me. I feel like I got a lot of time because we get to go till 7 o'clock tonight. But folks, I'm gonna go above my pay grade. Okay, I wasn't paid to do this. I don't know what I'm paid to do, for heaven's sakes. And by the way, thank you for your bringing me here. Thank you for letting me be part of the church, and I'm so well cared for. But can I encourage you? Be careful about what version of the Bible you read from regularly, that you study from. Because, you know, there are these, this is way beyond what I should be talking about, but there are these 2 basic philosophies of translation, and perhaps you've been through this, but on the one hand, there is what's called formal. I don't like that, hold on here. There is formal translation, and on the other hand, there is dynamic. And formal translation, and what we're talking here is certainly the King James, certainly the New King James, certainly the NASB, New American Standard, and certainly, but in a way that I'm dissatisfied with the ESV, okay? But I would recommend those. We're not talking about the New International. I'm not saying they're wicked, but don't make them your primary study Bible. And I'll tell you why, among other things. Formal, dynamic, it tries to be word for word, whereas dynamic tries to be thought for thought. As a matter of fact, dynamic translation, they try and take the thought of the passage and put it in terms and ideas that you would immediately understand. Now, what has to happen for him to do that? See, in order to do that, the translator has to interpret for you. He has to decide what you don't want your translator to interpret. You want to know what the scripture says. Now, I could show you all sorts of illustrations, but the big one, and this is what I'm after. The formal translation demands that the reader step into the culture of the text, whereas dynamic tries to bring the text into the culture of the reader. So it deliberately modernizes. So you get, this is the illustration I always use, you get a translation. It was called, when I was a kid in Rockford, Illinois, in a good church, and we were, and we were given these little Bibles to hand out to our friends and so on, these little New Testaments, and they also had some Psalms. And because it was called the Blue Denim Bible, it had a blue denim cover, it's for the guy in the street, kid in the street. And Psalm 23:1 was, "The Lord is my traffic cop." Now you see, there are so many things wrong with that. It makes your eyes water, right? I mean, for heaven's sakes. But do you hear what's going on there? Kid doesn't know what a shepherd is. And so you go to the Museum of the Bible, and I love it. It's in Washington, D.C. But they have a whole section on translation, and very, very positively, they're very thrilled with this. They have a little apparatus that they did when I was there. You could spin, and it showed you various ways in which especially with unreached peoples, that they translated John 1:29. behold the Lamb of God. And about half of them, you go this language, so on, about half of them, because the people being reached weren't familiar with lambs, never seen a lamb, and when they do any sort of ritual, they'd use a pig. So it became, behold, the swine of God that takes away the sin of the world. Now, not only, that's going to cause so much. Now, those are kind of radical examples, but so here's where I'm taking you. Learn to read the Bible in terms of its own culture. And one of the best things you can do is read a version which gives you exactly what it says, and if it's foreign to your culture, it asks you to step into that culture. Does that make sense to you? That's a healthy exercise. You know, the Amplified is an animal unto itself. I think the Amplified is a good study tool. I don't think it's very good. It's clunky, gives all those synonyms and so on. Now here's a problem. Oh, Bookman is in such trouble here. But here's a problem is that any word has what's called a semantic range. It can be used in a lot of different ways. I don't know, think of the word, pick one, but in any given context, only one of those words meaning is intended. And so one of the things, the habits of mind that I think the Amplified may get us into is that it could mean any one of these things. Well, the word is liable to any one of those meanings, but in this context, it means only one of those. That makes sense to you? And that's the way we use language, So if I stand here and say, I took too much time talking, I'm really in a box now. You know what I'm saying? If you say, well, that could mean a literal box. No, it doesn't mean a literal box. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense. So that was a poor example. All right, now, oh my goodness, shame on me. All right, now I'm going to get to business, and I'm going to go back to this PowerPoint, and again, let me just pick it up right here. So I gotta change my settings here. So Sunday, and we said that there were these two events. One is Jesus, and here's what I started to say and interrupted myself, which I want to do all too much. But the fact is that the prophecy that Jesus made there in Prairie, you're not going to see me until you welcome me as Messiah, till you cry out, Psalm 118, verse 25, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, verse 24, I think. Like I say, you'd have been there, you'd have thought, that's not going to happen. It happened. And it happened because Jesus was clever enough to alert the city to his coming in that midst of all that excitement which was exacerbated almost beyond what we can imagine by the miracle of Lazarus. Raising Lazarus from the tomb is in John's mind, that's where the Passion narrative starts. Now, we're 2 or 3 weeks before the Passion narrative, but nonetheless, John goes on and on and say that's when Jesus became a fugitive. The Sanhedrin got together and said, we got to arrest him, put out a notice. That's when the whole city was set to, a Twitter over the question, is the Messiah, is the Nazarene going to come? And Jesus betakes himself, if you don't mind, to little village of Ephraim. Then we talked about it. And here, I'll show it to you. This is probably, here is the, all right, watch. Here are the two routes. Remember, Galilee way to the north, Samaria in between Galilee and Samaria and Judea to the south. Judea is where Jerusalem is. That's where all these hundreds of thousands of Galilean Jews got to get in order to keep the Passover. And so they would come down into the Jezreel Valley, and then they would make their way. Now, this is the ridge route that they would like to take, but it goes right through Samaria. You can't be doing that. So they have to take this route that takes them down the Harod Valley, the shaft of the arrow, as it were, then down the eastern side of the Jordan Rift, and then back up to Jerusalem. And you're coming up from the east. Again, the backside, like the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. And again, think about this. When they are here, when they cross the river right there, they are at 1,300 feet below sea level. It's the lowest spot on the face of the earth by far. By the way, the next lowest is like 400 feet other than this rift. And when they cross right here into Jerusalem, they are at 2,300 feet above sea level. So, no, 2,700 feet. So, and it's about 15 miles. So in 15 miles, you're going to climb from 13, that's a 4,000 foot ascent in 15 miles. It is flat. Remember, Jesus said there was a man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. You're flat going down. So I'm saying that you'd much rather take the ridge route, but you can't. But on the other hand, here's Jesus. Here's what we talked about on last night. Forgive me. Jesus starts out from Ephraim. Today it's called Ophrah. And it's a remarkable little city. But at any rate, Jesus made his way because he had earned standing in Samaria. So he moves up through Samaria. He can get away with this. And then falls in with one of those bands of Passover pilgrims and makes his way just the same route that we talked about. It's going to take him 4 or 5 days. And he times his steps to arrive in Bethany, just outside the Sabbath zone, on Friday. So now all these people who are traveling with him, they don't want to be left out there in Bethany on Shabbat. There's no place for them to be. So they're going to go on into the city, and they have 2 days. They get there sometime on Friday, all day Saturday. They're telling all their friends, everybody who, what's the city asking? Is he coming? He is coming. He'll be here Sunday morning. And thus, as Jesus rides into the city, I go back to what Thomas said some weeks earlier. Stay with me now. But remember when Jesus earlier had said we're going to go to attend to Lazarus. And Thomas said, well, let's go die with him. Well, it's more dangerous now than it was then, because after Lazarus was raised, you remember the official Jewish leadership said we're going to put him to death. And I wonder what it must have been. You're one of those disciples, and you follow Jesus, and you know that the most powerful men in the Jewish world are intent on his death, and you're making your way up, and you stop in Bethany, and you stay there for Shabbat, and then on Sunday morning, you fetch the donkey, and he gets on the donkey, and now again, you can do. We used to do this. We used to go to Bethany and talk about this, and then walk down to. You can't anymore because of the wall. Bethany is behind the wall, but at any rate, you got to walk all the way down to Jericho and then walk all the way back up to get through that wall. But the point is that I just wonder if the disciples themselves, here you are, you're coming up, and you would have heard the rumble and a lot of commotion over there, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, they probably got an army waiting for us, And then you top the hill, and here are tens of thousands of people throwing down their garments, waving the palm fronds, crying out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Can you imagine if you're one of those disciples? I would say that this Passion Week is the most gut-wrenching, emotional roller coaster any man ever endured, But anyway, I'll come back to that. So that was on Sunday morning. Now I want to stop. I need to say real quickly, this is something else happened on Saturday night. It's going to be very important, and I want to talk to you about it. Now let me check in your notes. I've got this in your notes, so let's actually pretend we got notes here in front of us. So. Page, my pagination evidently is a little 7, page 7. So I say at the bottom of that page, on page 7. Now this is Saturday, or it's the weekend, because what I'm talking about here is Friday to Sunday on the top of the page, and I make the point. Matter of fact, I can do this too if I were any kind of a teacher. Because here are these notes. And so here on page 7, I'll give you some background. By the way, this chart right here you have in your notes, it can be helpful. Ponder it a little bit. I just try and lay out all of the events of each day, and then I give you kind of the same chart here where I give you the days and so. But anyway, it can be helpful. But here is page 7. And I mentioned that Jesus arrives in Bethany on Friday, and he brings these twofold message. He is coming. He'll be here Sunday morning. But on Saturday night, now there's some confusion about this. I'm not going to take the time to walk you through all of it, but believe me, there's really no question You know, to this day, this is very, very much the weekly pattern in an observant Jewish home. Friday, it's interesting, and this will become important later on. Friday is the only day of the week with a name in the Jewish world. They number the days of the week. Sabbath means seventh, right? Jesus rose on the first day of the week. They don't. The only day with a name is Friday, and it's called the day of preparation. And the reason it's called the day of preparation is because now you know that the Old Testament law said that on the Sabbath you're to do no work, but it doesn't very carefully define what work is. Well, the rabbis didn't leave that alone, did they? So they have all these long lists of what constitutes work. And on Friday afternoon, as I understand, I've never seen it happen, but as I understand, in an Orthodox Jewish home, there's a drawer where there's a pile of little black cloths. And on Friday afternoon, the kids will go and get those cloths, and they'll hang a cloth over every mirror in the house. And the reason is because if they don't cover their mirrors, maybe one of the women will walk by and forget it's Sabbath and see a gray hair and pluck it, and that would be reaping. And so they very carefully cover their mirrors. And I mean, it's just so many, and the point is this, that whatever you're going to do on Saturday, even today you can't get in a car on the Sabbath. And you know why? Because the Bible does say explicitly, Moses said that you're not to start a fire. And a car has a spark plug. And therefore, there's a fire. That's why you can't turn on a light switch, because there's a switch. So my point is, and the Jewish cycle of life is that the weekend is Friday and Saturday. Usually they'll go to their shops on Friday morning, but they'll go home about noon, and they have to prepare everything. I'm saying that you have to get everything ready, what you're going to eat, what lights you want on, and so on. Whatever you want on Shabbat, you have to prepare for on Fridays. That makes sense to you? Because then, as the sun goes down on Friday, folks, are you a fiddler on the roof fans? And if not, shame on you, for heaven's sakes. But go home and watch that movie. But it so reflects Jewish. It's such a good, I love the story. It's a great story, but it's so Jewish. But you remember as it begins, Tevye's coming home with a lame horse and the whole thing, you remember, and the girls are putting on their Sabbath best, and then, make me a match. Remember that song they're singing as they are, and then they, is that what it is? I can't remember, but they're. Anyway, the mother is down there getting everything ready and barking at Tevye and so on, and then they all gather around, and she says the prayers, covers her head, and so on. That's the coming in of Shabbat. So you gather as a family and you welcome Shabbat. Now, on the other hand, as the sun goes down on Saturday, there is the going out of Shabbat. And what happens on Saturday night, it's to this day, it's kind of fun to do. I don't remember if we did this in Jerusalem, but people will go out, and today you can go up to Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem, which is kind of the open mall, and it'll be like a ghost town before the sun goes down. Within about an hour after the sun goes down, all the shops are open, all the street musicians are out, every kid's walking around, and so it's the coming out of Shabbat. Now, what am I taking you there? That's what happens with this feast. You see, Jesus arrives on Friday, keeps the Sabbath. Now, Jesus, you can't buy a Jesus poster in Bethany, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, they're all sold out. I mean, Jesus is the biggest hero Bethany has ever known. And he raised one of their favorite sons just a few weeks ago. So now, unexpectedly, they show up for Shabbat. And undoubtedly, what happened is the word went out, the Nazarene is here. Well, let's plan a feast as the sun goes down. So it's on Saturday night that they gather for a feast. It's not at Lazarus's home, though Martha is serving, and it seems because it was, her brother's kind of the guest of honor along with Jesus. But at any rate, at that feast, and where is the feast? Do you remember? At the home of, I don't know, what is it? Simon, which is it, Dave? Remember, it's at the home of Simon the leper. You get an invitation, come on over, Simon the leper. We say maybe finger foods, who knows? No, that's a cheap joke. But the point is that I don't think Simon's a leper anymore. He's not a leper anymore. He's living in a cave outside of town. I don't know. Maybe he too has good reason to rejoice over the Nazarene. You know what I'm saying? But at any rate, they gather, and it's at that feast that Mary anoints Jesus. Let me tell you something. There are two, talking about the culture, there are two elements of modern life that we take every bit for granted, and appropriately enough, that were very rare in the Old Testament. I'm sorry, in the biblical world. And they are scent and color. Beautiful, bright colors and rich, deep aromas. Yeah, they were very expensive. And so for Mary to take that, if you'd have been there, and they didn't live in the houses always, there was a courtyard. You did most of the living in the courtyard. But there they are, they're having this feast, and people are standing around perhaps, and many of them are gathered around Jesus, and Mary makes her way up. And I'm going to tell you something, when she took that vial of expensive oil and just broke the seal, everybody within 10 feet, I think, would have stopped that quick and said, wow, what is that? And you might have expected that she would just take a little bit of a dab, which would have been so loving, and just refresh Jesus' forehead with it. She begins to slather that oil, and now that smell would have erupted throughout the place, and everybody would have stopped and so on. And I'm going to tell you something. You and I would have wondered about the propriety of, and everybody. The Bible says everybody, including all the apostles, said, Mary, what are you doing? And by the way, Jesus replied, and when you have the words on the page, Jesus said, let her alone. She has done this. And I know that a lot of people think he's barking at them. Hey, shut up. Leave her alone. I don't think there was any of that. I think, in fact, that everybody's surprise and kind of a little bit of horror was not unreasonable, for heaven's sakes. And I think Jesus very lovingly said, no. Let her do it. She's done this against the day of my burial. Now, I haven't made much of this, but Jesus never mentions his death until about 7 months before he dies. And when he does, his disciples are not only incredulous, they are scandalized. They're mad at him. Matthew 16:21 is where it says that Jesus got alone with his disciples at a place called, in the region of a place called Caesarea Philippi, and told them that I'm going to take him to Jerusalem, suffer many things of the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day I'll rise again. And you remember the next verse says, Matthew 16:22, the next verse says that Peter took Jesus. Now what it says literally is he took Jesus to himself. It's a compound verb there. He took Jesus to himself, and most translations have he took him aside. Like he put his arm around him and said, now we need to talk about it. I don't think so at all. I think he took him to himself like this. I think he grabbed him and said, don't be talking that way. So, the point is that Jesus again and again, as a matter of fact, that verse in Matthew 16:21 says, from that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how he must die and be raised again. Well, that would suggest, and it exactly reflects the Greek, that he had never done it before, but once he did it over and over again. And that's exactly what you have in the scriptures. So beginning about 6 or 7 months before Jesus' death, he began to tell his disciples, even the angels who encountered the women at the why are you looking for him? He's alive. He's as he told you again and again. So Jesus again and again had said, I'm going to die, and on the third day I'll rise again. Every time he mentions his death, he says, on the third day, I'll rise again. You want an index of how thoroughly they didn't get it. Wouldn't you might have thought that maybe one or two of the disciples would remember that and say, it's awful, I can't believe it, but he did say it right. Let's go hide behind a tree and see what happens. None of that. They absolutely missed it. So here's where I'm taking you. Jesus had begun appropriately enough, and I'd love to talk to you about this, but there's a good reason for this. But Jesus had begun only about 6 or 7 months before his death to start talking about it. He talked about it again and again. there's one person in the record who gets it, and that's Mary. And that's why he says, wherever this is remembered, she'll be remembered, because she, man, can you imagine what a heaviness it was to Jesus' heart? That no matter how carefully he foretold, they wouldn't hear it. And here's this one sweet sister who gets it. And so now that's on Saturday night. Now, as I said, there were everybody in the room reacted in the same way. What are you thinking about? And Jesus, I think, lovingly, patiently, gently rebuked them and said, no. Leave her alone. She's done this against the day of my burial. But there was one guy, and only one. Jesus didn't even direct that directly at Judas. But you see, Judas, don't try to rescue Judas, all right? Judas loved his sin more than he loved what he knew to be the truth. And that's the, forgive me, only ticket to hell. The only way you get there is to defy what you know to be the truth. I don't care who you are and what kind of dark jungle you live in. There is truth that God has set before you manifestly, and it's compelling truth. And if you respond to it, the Spirit of God, God's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him, and so on. But Judas, who had more truth than about any man who ever lived, was a thief. And he loved his sin more than he loved what he knew to be the truth. And so he had rejected it. Now, he was a good imposter. And we'll come to it in just a bit. But the fact is that this is a theme. Never forget this. Young people, never forget this. Sin makes you stupid. And what I mean by that is that you cling to your sin, and everything gets distorted. The way you think, the way you feel, the way you react, everything. It just makes you morally and, quite frankly, intellectually stupid. You'll believe the most ridiculous lies because you love your sin. And Judas had loved his sin. And so my point is that the one guy in the room who took personal offense was Judas. And he kept the bag. He too said, Mary, you shouldn't have done this. You should have given it to the poor. But he was going to skim some of that for himself. That's what was at stake with him. So it was on Saturday night that there is a feast where Mary anoints Jesus. Jesus, everybody gets after Mary. Jesus gently rebukes those who are getting, and Judas takes it very personally. Does that make sense to you? That's going to become important. Yeah. That's all right. I love it.
Just a second. Matthew and Mark says the home of Simon the leper, but John says the home where Lazarus lived. So I was wondering, are they related?
Some have conjectured that, and it could be that it was a clan situation, and so they lived in the same villa, estate, and so on. But let me go to it real quickly. This is excellent. So John chapter 12. So they made him a feast. There they made him a supper. So, all right, now I'm going to get personal, okay? What translation are you reading? The prosecution rests. No, it doesn't say. See, this is a problem, and I run it. Look, I have the NKJV, which is kind of the KJV redone, and everybody knows the KJV is the real Bible, right? No, I'm teasing. I don't believe that, but the point is, it is very, very formal, and it doesn't say he lived there. It just says where Lazarus was. Does that make sense to you?
Mine says lived, so I can send you a different Bible.
It says lived.
Lived, yeah.
That's where the NIV is kind of interpreting for you. It's representing as where he lived. Oh, it says he was there at the feast. That's what it says.
Oh, mine says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived.
All right, time out. I was being too hard on it. I think that maybe the reference there is to Bethany and not the house. So he did, in fact, live there. And that's what is being said here. Now, I will say that even at that, and it's okay, I think that's a legitimate representation of what's at stake here. Listen, if you're, I have the spiritual gift of talking out of both sides of my mouth, and I'm about to do that. But if you're going to do dynamic equivalence, the NIV does it better than anybody else. They're less radical. They're not the Living Bible or the Message or something. So, but and I think, and the NIV translators were honest, good men who wanted to, but I think they go too far. But I think there is probably, where Lazarus lived in terms of Bethany. Yeah, that's good to get that straightened out. Dave, what were you going to say?
Well, the Greek is from Amy, so
Remaining.
it's from Amy,
Just where he was, yeah. So the point is that this is what it actually says, right? Where Lazarus was. Now you can kind of say, well, does that mean he was in the house, or does that mean it was his village, or so on? I'd kind of rather it didn't try and specify it for you, as long as it's not specified in the original. Yeah, good point. All right, very good. All right, I don't mean to beat up on you. Well, turns out I did. What am I talking about? But all right, so Saturday night. Now, the reason I stress it is because I'll leave it alone for now, Saturday night. All right, so let's go back to work. And now, so much of this is so much fun to talk about that I get bogged down. But let me take you then to, so this is the question I left you with and kept you up all night long. Given Sunday, why Friday? Well, if the question is, given Sunday, you know what I'm saying? Given the fact they welcomed him on Sunday, why are they crying for his crucifix on Friday? The answer I like to say is Monday and Tuesday, which are days of messianic proclamation. Now, I have a lot of notes, and I'm going to abandon this. You can go here to, this is the triumphal entry where I give you some of the background and so on. But here are these 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, days of messianic proclamation. And listen, I am going to do inexcusable damage to these. We're going to go very quickly. I love these 2 days. I'd really suggest spend some time. This is exciting. I always say, if you came to me with one free pass on your newly invented time machine, I think I'd dial up Monday and Tuesday. I'm not kidding. This is stunning. This is a show. But I'm going to be very quick. So I'm going to walk you through it and as I said to you yesterday, folks, what I'm really hungry for is that you really begin to get your arms around the narrative, and you can think through this week. And a lot of the details you can work on, in days to come. But here's what happens. Number one, and let me say this: Jesus stays in Bethany. That is brilliant, because there is in this culture, and it's the same today. I used to travel in Israel with a bus driver by Nael. I love Nael, and he had come to the Lord, but he was a total flake, and so I had to. But he was Bedouin. And that Bedouin is the Arabic word for desert. He had lived, and he never lived on the desert, but his parents came off the desert, and he understood Bedouin culture. And I would get him talking about Bedouin culture sometime, and this is the point he'd always make. He'd say, "If I invite you into my house, I am duty bound at whatever cost to protect you. And there could be nothing that would bring greater shame, not just on me, but on my family, on my clan, than if I were to take you into my house." Now, this shows up at least twice in the Bible, and it's kind of gut-wrenching for us. First of all is Lot. Remember when the wicked men, they're in Sodom and so on, and he offers his daughters. You think, who does this? And then there's this wicked priest who's gone to fetch his concubine in Judges 19 and gets to Gibeah, and the men come and finally they take his concubine and throw her out, remember, and they abuse her all night long. And I'm not saying it's noble. I'm not saying it's excusable. I think in both of those cases it's wicked, but it is a function of the culture that the host is absolutely duty-bound to protect you. Now, think about what that means. Jesus goes to Bethany. Bethany is just off the main road coming up from the east. There's always going to be all sorts of traffic there. So Jesus can just step out of Bethany, and he's going to be surrounded by these people who adore him. And remember now, what's at stake is that both the Jewish and the Roman leadership doesn't want a riot. That's what's at stake. And so again and again, I told you before, Jesus is a fugitive. He has to be so circumspect. He has to plan his steps. This is really clever. So Bethany is genius. And the point being that if they try to go down under cover of night and spirit Jesus out of the home of Lazarus, that whole village is going to take up arms, and they're going to have a major riot, and everybody knows. That makes sense to you? So Jesus every night goes back to Bethany. And because of the crowds, even along the way, he's perfect. It's about 1.25 miles from the walls through to Bethany. But you're just going right up the Mount of Olives and then just on the other side. So Jesus on Monday morning comes in. He sees the fig tree. He curses the fig tree. All right, you remember this story? I mentioned it before, that fig trees blossom kind of continually, kind of erratically. But there's one harvestable season of figs, and that's the summer figs. And that's where you prune the tree and you get all the old stuff off and so on. You prepare the tree. Now, the signal for it's time to begin to prepare for the summer fruit is when those blossoms come. And because of the nature of fig trees, if you got summer blossoms, you ought to have winter figs. You will have winter figs. And so Jesus, all right, here's something else. Don't talk about it. But the Jews they don't eat in the morning. They don't begin the day with a meal. Some do today because they've been westernized. But that culture, it's a culture that's built around a hot sun. So you want to be at work, in the fields, at wherever you're going to be working, you want to be there before the sun comes up. So you get up and you go to work. And then when the sun gets hot, it's the siesta concept, you go in. And by the way, when you go in mid-morning, about 10 o'clock, you go find some shade and rest and so on. That's when you have your first meal of the day. That's also when the morning sacrifice. Remember, every day there was a morning and evening sacrifice. First one was mid-morning, and that's when you would pray. That's the time of prayer and so on. Then you have a meal and rest, and then you'd wait for the sun to get past its apex, and then you would go out once again, work till the sun went down, and then come in and have a second meal. So my point is that the Jews did not begin the day with a meal, but you might snack. And that was perfectly legitimate. And one of the ways you might do that is if you're walking by a grain field, it was perfectly legitimate. Take some of that grain and just get the little, the wheat kernels and so on and snack on those. Or if there were winter figs, because the winter fig is not harvestable. And so you're welcome to go and just get a little bit of the fruit out of it, the meat out of it and so on. So the point is that Jesus sees this fig tree. It's got the blossoms, and it has no figs. And he pronounces a curse. Now, the next morning, that's Monday morning, on Tuesday, according to Mark, very explicit, as he returns to the city, he finds it, they find it withered from the ground up. And now I believe, it makes sense to me, because the Bible is not, Jesus doesn't say this, but I think very possibly, very probably, the reason that fig tree was so, if you don't mind, offensive to Jesus is because it so well represented that generation of Israel. Yesterday, he rode in, and the whole city threw down their palm branches, threw down their coats and waved the palm branches. But Jesus knows by Friday, he knows what's going to happen. He knows their hearts. And so I think but for whatever reason, that's on the way into the city. Now, what he does then, and I'm just going to, what he does is goes into the temple and cleanses the temple. Now, let me just talk to you about this real quickly. This is, I can get lost in this, but the temple in Jesus, all right, Israel in her history has had two temples. The first built by Solomon, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. The second built by, remember this guy, Zerubbabel. He didn't get as much attention as he might, but And it was a horribly disappointing temple, a little tiny thing in an unwalled city made out of wood, and it was an embarrassment. During the intertestamental period, a family called the Hasmoneans cleaned it up some, but Herod remodeled the second temple. So the second temple was built by Solomon, Zerubbabel, Ezra chapter 1, and then remodeled by Herod, and then destroyed. You know that they finally finished building this? Herod died, put it on the record, in 1 BC. I know every book you read is going to say 4 BC. It's not true. It's 1 BC. No, all right. But anyway, so Herod, who is this great builder, I mean to tell you, he is amazing. He was a genius. Herod is one of the greatest geniuses who ever lived. I'm talking about, there are 4 Herods in the New Testament, but I'm talking about the paterfamilias, right? Granddaddy, the guy who, and that we call him Herod the Great, because Josephus, it means the older. But Herod, because he had a brother named Herod. There were always, they did this and that. I don't know. I always say there were a lot of George Foreman going on back then. I don't know if that works for you, but George Foreman had 5 boys and he named them all George Foreman. So, I mean, that was kind of, and it was a different set of, but at any rate, the point is that Herod is worth your time. He's worth studying because he is all over the New Testament. And not personally, because he dies just weeks after Jesus is born. And the only time he actually enters the New Testament record is when he tries to kill the baby Jesus. But his impact, his family, and so on, it is so important as a background. And Herod was a massive builder. He was a genius. He was one of the greatest. And here's the thing. Have you heard the term Pax Romana? You know that word? And it means the Roman peace. And it was established. Have you ever heard of the Temple of Janus in Rome? Probably not, but there was this temple that had been been there since the days of the Republic, 400 years before Christ. And when Rome was at war, the doors were open, and when Rome was at peace, the doors were closed. And it had only been closed a couple of times before, but Augustus closed them, and they stayed closed for 200 years. And that's the Pax Romana. Now, it means Roman peace, but when you think peace, you think of serenity, and everybody. That's not what it means at all. It means the forced absence of violence. It was a heavy-handed peace. But my point is this, that before the Rome, in the Old Testament, you have all of these kings. And I like to say that most of the kings in the Bible are kinglets. And what I mean by that is not some big, massive guy. He's just got a walled city, and he's got some people who serve him, and over here in the next hill is another walled city. And they're usually fighting with one another, because before Rome, the way to aggrandize yourself as a king was conquest. So you conquer somebody else's walled city. Now you have a bigger, a more important king. That's all over with Rome. They're in charge. They're no, you know, it's there might be local skirmishes. The Samaritans might beat up on the Galileans, but as far as any real, it's not happening. So, beginning with Rome, the way you aggrandize yourself, make yourself more worthy, famous, and so on, is architecture. Architecture is the new conquest. And nobody in the world was better at it than Herod. Nobody. And I've already spent too much time, but suffice it to say that by reason of the land that he conquered, he almost immediately became wealthy beyond calculation. And he had just constant revenue flowing in. And so he was able to engage in these huge buildings, and not only in his domain. He built temples in cities all over the empire. He rebuilt the agora, you know, the walkway with the shops and everything, and Antioch and so on. And all of this was very pleasing to Rome. The Romans loved Herod. They didn't trust him. He was a crook, but they loved him because he kept the money coming at any rate. So he built this marvelous temple. Now, what I'm after actually is just to make this point, that this is a model, by the way, as you might expect. But here, the temple, this entire area is about 36 acres, folks. What's your footprint here, Rory? You got any idea? How many acres you got? Maybe 3. This is 36 acres. And I won't talk anymore about it. Now, this is the temple. The actual temple is that 90-foot building in the middle. But all of these courts and so on, and all these stoa, see those pillared porches all the way around? All of that is designed for public, just people to gather and so on, and they're just beautiful, unspeakably beautiful. And so the point is that on Monday morning, Jesus comes into the city. Now, he had done it earlier in John chapter 2. There are 4 Passovers in the life of Jesus. That is, I'm talking the ministry. There are 4 Passovers which are identifiable in Jesus' ministry. Do you have it somewhere in your kabeza that Jesus' ministry lasted 3.5 years? If I just ask you how long, do you have that 3.5-year figure? That's entirely a function of the fact that John gives us, or at least alludes specifically and then to 4 Passovers. So the point is, Jesus cleanses the temple at the first Passover, ignores it for the second, and then cleanses it on the 4th Passover. So in John 2, you have that initial cleansing just after the miracle of the water to wine, very early in Jesus' ministry. And then now on Monday morning, he does it again. Now, let me talk to you about it real quickly. Number one, understand that you see somewhere here, I have a chart right here. And I'm just going to stop here. You can by the way, this PowerPoint is in that Dropbox, so you can have this PowerPoint if that's helpful. But this is everything you need to know about the Pharisees and Sadducees. That's what I like to say. This is everything you need to know. Now, there's a lot more you ought to know, and it's a lot of fun to know. It's very interesting, but you're not getting to first base if you don't understand this about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And quite simply, get this, the Pharisees controlled the synagogue. Now, let's just make sure, all right? Synagogue's not a church. It's not a temple. Synagogue is a place where you come together. Synagoge, that means to gather together, to come together. And by the New Testament, the rabbinical standard was that if you have 10 men who can make a minyan, kind of a quorum. But what it means is if you have 10 adult men who can gather on Sabbath morning without violating the Sabbath day's journey. That makes sense to you? So one of the laws that the Jews had, and it's going to become very important, is that you can't travel on the Sabbath day further than a Sabbath day's journey. It was somewhere over a mile. Now, the idea is not that you count your steps, and after you've walked a mile, you have to sit down and wait for the sun to go down. The idea is a zone. And wherever you are, when the sun goes down, describe a zone just over a mile, a circle, you're the center, and you can move around freely in there, but you can't leave it. And if you're not in that zone, you can't come in. Does that make sense to you? Now, the Jews were not under obligation. Listen, there is no synagogue in the Old Testament. It arose, we don't know exactly how, but it arose during the intertestamental period, the 400 years after Malachi. But in the New Testament, it's everything. And to this day, the Jews build their life around the synagogue, and they would live clustered around their synagogue. So you wanted to be, does that make sense to you? So if you had 10 men who lived within a tight enough zone that they could gather at a central point, you build a synagogue there. Now, you can't have a synagogue without a copy of the Torah and the 5 books of Moses, and you can't go down to Barnes & Noble and buy that copy. You got to have a scribe to copy it for you. And so you maybe can buy it from another synagogue, but generally you'll hire somebody, you'll train somebody, you'll take a young man and train him and send him off to yeshiva, and he will actually copy it out for you. But the point is, and the scribes, now I don't have scribes here, but scribes were a guild. They were a professional guild. They were copyists. Pharisees, they were a community. They were just people. There was no union card. You didn't pay your dues or anything like that. But the idea was that a Pharisee was a 24-hour-a-day, 7 days a week law keeper. That's what he did. He kept the law, and he studied it, and he tried to come up with ways he could be more punctilious than he was yesterday. So the law keeper, so the Pharisees, but the scribes embraced the Pharisaic mentality. So the scribes were a guild, but so you see them together all the time. One, you scribes and Pharisees. They're kissing cousins. They're joined at the hip. They're Siamese. You see what I'm saying? But they're different. They describe different lives and different functions of life. But they are, all right, way too much time. So now the point is that the Pharisees, for that reason, controlled the synagogue. They believed the entire law, including the oral law, the traditions. But here's the point. They were greatly respected. As a matter of fact, it's understated. They were revered. And now think about this. This is going to become so important. The Pharisees taught that the way to be certain of entrance into the kingdom was to keep the law. The Pharisees and they show up in the distantly in the Talmudic, the Jewish rabbinical literature and so on, their spirit. And they talk a lot about the grace of God, the grace of Yahweh, but what they meant is God was so gracious, he gave us the law. All we have to do is keep the law, and we can get into the kingdom. And so that was their message. And you read, Jesus gets after them about their public display. They'd come and they'd tear off little vegetables and throw it in, and they'd come and have somebody blow a trumpet before they gave the tithes and so on. And you're thinking, well, how odious is that? No, you got to understand that to the common man, that Pharisee, he's going to coattail me into the kingdom. If I support him, if I make it, they lived on the alms, they didn't work, and if I support him and make that lifestyle possible, then I too. So you see, there's a lot at stake here. The more zealous he is, the more punctilious, the more horribly legalistic that he is about keeping the law, the more certain he is to get into the kingdom, and he's going to coattail me in there. And so they were tremendous, but they were greatly feared. On the other hand, the Sadducees comes from Zadok, an Old Testament, they call themselves Zadokites, but I won't get into it. But the Sadducees, and where you find them in your New Testament, they're the chief priests. And so the point is that the chief priests, or the Sadducees, controlled the temple. Now they did that by bribing the Romans. They told the Roman government how much they could produce in the temple, and then they got what was left over. So they were total unbelievers. They didn't believe in anything, and they were entirely despised and resented, and they returned the favor. Now, here's the point. One of the ways in which go back here, they made the most awful merchandise of the people. Passover is the one of the three feasts. Remember, there are those three feasts, Passover in the spring, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, where it's a pilgrimage feast. The only one that involves a personal family sacrifice is Passover. And that Passover had to be a lamb of certain qualifications and so on. And most people, because they came from all over the world for Passover, most people would buy a lamb once they got there. Well, the chief priests had realized we got a good thing going for us here, because we can insist that unless you buy from our authorized shepherds, which means what? We're going to get a kickback. Unless you buy from them, we're not going to accept, because after you bought the lamb, then you had to go to present it to the priest. And that's exactly what they did. And so you were paying above market prices. Oftentimes you might get a lamb that wasn't even qualified, but nonetheless they would accept it, because the shepherd, who might just bear a family resemblance, I always say, to the priest, but nonetheless he had sold you this, and so the people knew it. Plus, in order to build this temple, Herod had gotten the Romans to allow him, Herod the Great, the guy who built that, had gotten the Romans to allow him to put a 2-day temple tax on every Jew in the Roman world. And you think, well, big deal. How is he going to collect that? He didn't have to collect that. Every synagogue, every community, they'd get together once a year, and they'd all their 2-day temple tax, and they'd put it with several villages would get together, and they'd hire a security force, and they'd make their way all the way to Jerusalem, and they'd blow the trumpets and so on. Every day. This is the biggest cash cow Herod ever produced, is the temple. So, and that's why Rome was quite protective of it, because this, like I say, this was their cash cow. But at any rate, my point is that the Sadducees agreed to collect that temple tax, but only in the local currency, and then he would charge these are the money changers, and they're charging horribly usurious rates. So my point is that the common worshiper, whatever his spiritual condition, he's making his way to Passover, and he knows he's going to get cheated blind. And by the people who are supposed, they're the deputized supervisors of the temple. And I would say you can't go down the street and start the Second Baptist Temple. You know what I'm saying? You're stuck with this one. And so my point being this, that the people despised it. All right, now very quickly. And get past the idea that Jesus' cleansing of the temple was a matter of some momentary pique that he came in, oh, I can't believe it. It makes me so mad, and just flew into a rage. I think there was righteous anger going on here, but this is strategy. Now, I want you to think about this. Jesus cleanses the temple twice. One other thing I got to tell you. You're familiar with the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin means the council. It usually comes to us in the Bible as the council or the Senate sometimes in some versions. Every town had a Sanhedrin. It was a town council. The big one, the great Sanhedrin, was in Jerusalem, 70 men, and they controlled everything about common life in Israel. They were in charge. The Romans governed with a heavy fist, but they didn't want to handle your religious matters, your local matters, and so on. So there always had to be somebody, and it was the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin at this point was composed equally. There were 70 men, but it was almost immediately split between Pharisee and Sadducee. They hated each other. They despised each other. And so what happens is but by reason of Jesus' popularity, in order for his Jewish enemies to get Jesus dead, they have to get the Romans involved. That's going to be very important. Does that make sense to you, honestly? File that away for just a minute. Very early in his ministry, suddenly, Jesus, nobody ever heard of this guy. He changed some water to wine at a private funeral, and there was some talk, maybe locally, but now Jesus goes down. That's up in Galilee. He goes down to Jerusalem, down to the temple at Passover, first Passover of his ministry, and he cleanses the temple. Folks, I like to say, if there was a woman in the temple that morning who 6 weeks ago had sextupulets, is that how you say that? This was more exciting than that. I don't care whatever happened in your life, to watch that Nazarene grab those cords and start to throw those money changer table and drive you. Now, how did he get away with it? That quick. He was the hero of the people. You try and do anything to him, you kidding me? You're going to have a riot. And so Jesus cleanses the temple at the very first, and he does, this is strategy. Number one, he catapults himself into Jewish worldwide notoriety. You got to understand, these people have come from every corner of the Jewish world. They're getting on a bus and going home, and there's nothing they're going to be talking about except this crazy Nazarene who, you never saw anything like it. So that quick, everybody is talking about Jesus of Nazareth. But that quick, he is one of the greatest heroes the Jewish people ever knew, and so his enemies can't touch him. That makes sense to you? They wanted to take him. They could not because they feared the people. So that's the first cleansing. You tell me, Bible quiz. When he cleansed the temple when he cleansed the temple, either time, but when he cleansed the temple in John chapter 2, whose turf is he on? Sadducees or Pharisees? Come on, talk to me. It's on Sadducean turf, right? The Sadducees were on the temple. All right. How do you think the Pharisees felt about that? I'm sure this is great. Can't get enough of this, for heaven's sakes. Now, interestingly, for 2 years, Jesus doesn't touch the temple. But what's he doing? Synagogue to synagogue. Now whose turf is he on? And you can watch this happen in the pages of the Gospels where the Pharisees, not the Sadducees, what do they care? They're probably saying, hey, we're having fun now. But the Pharisees are more and more angry. But again, it seems like, and I think there is strategy on this. So on Monday of the Passion Week, Jesus cleanses the temple for a second time. Folks, do you realize what he's doing? He is galvanizing the hatred of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And it's going to take him 5 days to get him on a cross. This is not accidental. Does that make sense to you? Delighted the Pharisees, angered the Sadducees for all of those months delighted the Sadducees, angered the Pharisees. But now, when he cleanses, when he takes control, and folks, you got to understand, this is, I always say, imagine if the government can not do what they want to do, I guess, but if they were to announce that all retail stores had to close the day after Thanksgiving and couldn't open until January 5th or something, you say, oh man, that's a tough season. That's what's going on here. Jesus is shutting down this trade at that moment when this is. So the point is that, now, I'm going to go further real quickly, and then we'll take a break. Here's the thing. Jesus cleanses the temple on Monday. He goes back to Bethany. Then on Tuesday, he comes in. Now, again, I just want you to understand that it's almost impossible to imagine. I don't know what happy analogy there might be. I was in Indianapolis when they won the Super Bowl. I just happened to be living there when they won the Super Bowl. And that was kind of the spirit. Everybody couldn't talk about anything else. Everybody was wearing their colors and so on. It's a dim analogy, but the fact is that it's almost impossible to imagine the level of excitement that gripped this city. And this city was swollen to several times its normal size. And there are various estimates, but undoubtedly at least 1 million people had come to Jerusalem and for the Passover. But at any rate, so that's on Monday. Tuesday, he returns. Now, his enemies have spent the night trying to come up with some way to derail, if you don't mind this, Jesus Express. And in our culture, you guys, what do you got to do, you young guys? What do you got to do to prove yourself a real man? You know, if you want to prove yourself a man among men, I don't know, you beat everybody in a room in arm wrestling or something like that. But in that culture, the way you prove yourself a man among men is to put your enemy to silence in open debate. Honest to goodness. And now Jesus' enemies come one by one. The Sadducees come and say, by what authority do you do these things? You know, they want him to say, I do this because I'm Messiah. Because they're longing to hear him openly claim to be Messiah king. Because then they can go to the Romans and say, you got a pretender king here. But Jesus is so clever. And this is rabbinical reasoning. I'd love to walk you through it. But Jesus simply says, I'll ask you a question. Perfectly legitimate. This is open debate. I'll ask you a question. The baptism of John, was it of heaven or of men? Seems kind of like, where'd that come from? Oh, that's genius. Because now the Sadducees put their heads together and they say, well, if we say that the baptism of John was of heaven, we got our answer because John announced him as Messiah. And if he's Messiah, he's got every right to the temple. Everybody knows that. But if we say that the baptism of John was of men, these people will kill us because they love John the Baptist. Oh, Jesus was so clever. And so they come back and they say, Master, we have no answer. The place would have erupted. There would have been catcalls and huzzas and applause, and the place would have erupted. This is a knockout. Then the Pharisees, the woman with this, paid tribute to Caesar and Jesus, and they come back and they say, you have answered well. And then the Sadducees come back again with a woman with the 7 husbands. They're asking about the resurrection, and Jesus says, you don't know this. He proves the resurrection from the burning bush incident and so on. The point is, and in Luke 20, verse 40, the conclusion is that after that, no man dared ask him anything at all. Now, you've got to imagine that in terms of that culture and that situation where they were so angry with him, and their anger was galvanized, and they'd spend all night in their best minds and come up with the most, trying to trick him and catch him in his words, the Bible says. And he puts them all to silence. Oh, it's so big. And then Jesus argues from Psalm 110 for his own messiahship. He speaks these parables of condemnation about the son and the marriage and the vineyard and so on. And then you have this young man who comes and with a good heart says, what's the first and great commandment? Remember that? And Jesus answers that. But now, this is where I want to take you. Now we're going to take a break. In Matthew 23, and I'm sort of deliberating the question, given Sunday, why Friday? And I walk you through all this. And then here on page 10, I think, 7C, you have this last public discourse. But let me take you to Matthew 23. Now, let me just tell you 2 things I got to tell you. Number one, that's not what I want. Come on. Number one, understand this, folks, that Jesus, and this is, I give you early on, I didn't spend any time with it, might be helpful, a list of 10 important insights, and just kind of what I think are principles that are good to have in your mind. And one of them is that Jesus was an absolute, he had a rhetorical strategy by which he would test what seemed to be the willingness of people to follow him. And he would simply put his finger on their most sensitive spiritual nerve. Does that make sense to you? You don't get to heaven by selling everything you have. But that rich young ruler said he wanted to follow Jesus. He said, okay, if that's what you feel, this is what I'm demanding of you. And he was testing his willingness. He did it again and again. I take you 4 or 5 places where it's explicit in the text. The big one is when you have a mass of Jewish people who seem to be willing to follow Jesus. For instance, had welcomed him as king on Sunday morning. If Jesus wanted to test the genuineness of that allegiance, he would simply demand that they choose between him and the Pharisees. Because of everything I already told you. The Pharisees were revered. They were kind of our ticket into the kingdom. And this is the Sermon on the Mount. The key verse of the Sermon on the Mount is, let me just tell you this. I think both Matthew 23 and Matthew 5, if you're going to understand what's going on in those passages, picture Jesus pointing. And what I mean by that is this. In the Sermon on the Mount, here's this great mass of people. We can stand, I saw the picture there, and we can stand at the place where almost certainly Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. We understand the dynamics and so on. But the point is, there were people, and there were a lot of people who had broken their crutches over their knee that morning. You know what I'm saying? There were a lot of people who had come. Jesus had healed them and so on. But now Jesus goes up on a side of a hill where it's a natural acoustic theater. And I like to say that way over here in the corner is this little gaggle of really, really angry Pharisees. And you can see them a mile away. Their blue is bluer and their fringe is longer and so on. And here they stand. And Jesus says, Matthew 5, verse 20, unless your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you're never going to glimpse the kingdom of God. Now, folks, a gasp would have gone on. I'm back in Matthew 5. This is the Galilean ministry. But listen, the Pharisees loved to refer to one another. They would refer to themselves as gatekeepers. Hello, good morning, fellow gatekeepers, because they kept the law so perfectly. Not only they were certain to get into the kingdom, but God was going to give them the opportunity to decide who else got in. And for Jesus to say, they're not getting in. Now, what is Jesus doing there? Think about the Sermon on the Mount. The rest of the sermon, they say unto you, I say unto you. They say unto you, I say unto you. You've heard it said by those crooks, but I say unto you. And then the end of the Sermon on the Mount is, picture him pointing, there's a broad way, straight to destruction. Help yourself, or there's a narrow way. You can build your house on the sand. You're going to be destroyed, or you can build. Now, that's what he's doing in Matthew 23. Because, and I'm asking the question given Sunday, why Friday? And my answer is that Jesus, number one, I haven't made this point very carefully, but hear me. Jesus on Monday and Tuesday behaves more messianically than ever else in his life. Malachi 3 says explicitly that the Messiah, the messenger of the covenant, that's the new covenant, will come suddenly to his temple. Ezekiel has Messiah ruling in the temple. Every Jewish mind knows that the Messiah has every claim to the temple. And for Jesus to come in and claim the temple, and then for 2 days, there's no record of his possessing the temple in John 2 at the beginning, but now he possesses it for 2 days. And Mark says he wouldn't as much as allow a man to carry a vessel of water across the temple. I don't know exactly what it means, but that 36 acres, for 2 days, Jesus took control of it. Now, you can't imagine, especially to a Jewish mind, how he could more thoroughly claim the Messianic identity. Does that make sense to you? But now, as he leaves sometime on Tuesday afternoon, this is his last discourse. You have Jesus spoke to the multitudes, and he's saying, you know, do what they say, but don't do what they do because they're crooks. And then you have these woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Now, just get in the moment. Imagine this now. All the excitement of this week. It's Passover, the city. Many people have come just because they heard about Lazarus and so on. Now the Nazarene does show up, and he rides in on Sunday. We welcome now. Monday he comes back, and he does it again. He took control of the temple. He ran those crooks out of there. But now on Tuesday afternoon, as he leaves the city, he stands there and again pointing, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. You're like so many whited sepulchres. At Passover season, the rabbis had demanded that, had made a stand, a law, as it were, that you had to go out, and you see your tomb was generally just on somewhere on your property. It looked just like a cave. And it might get overgrown. You hadn't used it for several years, and somebody's on his way up to Passover, and he's kind of tired. He says, I'm going to take a rest. So he goes and sits there. Doesn't know it's your tomb. You come out and say, hey, I'm sorry, you're sitting next to Granddaddy's tomb. Now you're unclean. You can't go to Passover. So they had said that you had to whitewash your tombs. So they would just take some cheap lye and slop it on there just so people know. And Jesus says, you're like so many whitewashed tombs. You look good on the outside, but men just brush up against you and they become a stench in God's nostrils. That's the idea. Unclean in the Bible. The Jewish mind doesn't deal with abstractions. It deals with concrete. And so it means you stink. If you're impure, you don't like people around you who stink, and God doesn't either. So that's what he's saying. You're full of dead men's bones. You're going to make people stink in the nose of God. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. You compass land and sea to make one proselyte, and when you got him, you make him twofold more the son of hell than he was before. These are not words calculated to endear Jesus to the Pharisaic fraternity. Can we agree on this? They are words calculated to make that city choose. Does that make sense to you? So I'm saying that what goes on, I didn't read very many of them, but they are, and he winds up by saying, woe on you brood of vipers. This is his conclusion at the end of this excoriation. And by the way, this word woe, W-O-E, is usually reserved for the prophets who cry out against this or that Gentile nation. But now he winds up by saying, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Now remember, they taught that the way to be assured of entrance into the kingdom is to keep the law, and they were the best people in the world at it. Jesus had come to put the lie to that claim. And so now he is doing what he has done again and again. He is using, if you don't mind, hard or demanding words to drive you to a choice. Does that make sense? That's Tuesday. Jesus is going to leave the city, go back to Bethany, and he's going to leave that city with a choice. Now, I think they've got a few days to ponder it. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Very early on Friday, very early, the word is going to go out that this one whom we welcomed as king, whom we cheered as he cleansed the temple, is now on trial for his life on the west side of the city before Pilate, and the city is going to wake up, and you can imagine with what wildfire speed that would have spread throughout the city, and they're going to gather there, and Pilate is going to give them a choice. Who would you have me release? And when they cry out, give us Barabbas, they are announcing their decision. I want you to see the connection. Jesus drove them to a choice. I like to say it this way. Now we're going to take a break here. Number one, on Sunday, Jesus rode into the city of Jerusalem and genuinely, legitimately, fully qualified, offered himself as the long-awaited Messiah, deliverer of Genesis 3:15. He offered himself, not only to the nation as their king, but to the Jews as their savior. Does that make sense to you? That's the message of Sunday. The message of Monday and Tuesday is this: you don't take Jesus on your terms. You take him on his terms. They were willing to take him on their terms. We're okay for the sin department. We don't need any help there, but we'd sure like some deliverance from Rome. Jesus, no, it doesn't work that way. So unless you're willing to turn your back on the self-righteous false gospel, the false gospel of self-righteousness preached by the Pharisees, you're not going to have Jesus. That makes sense to you? That's Tuesday. All right, let's take a break. And any instructions? So let's take a break and, yeah, 15 minutes. I'm starting 15 minutes from now, so no more, okay? So do what you got to do, but.
All right, everybody. I know that went really fast, and we'd kind of promised a half-hour break, but we're going to try to get going again here so that we can make the most of our time. We were planning on being done at 11:30. It may be 11:45 or noon when Dr. Bookman gets done. If you need to leave, though, obviously do what you need to do in that regard. But we'll aim to be done between 11:45 and noon-ish.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
So without any further complications or delay, I'll let you have your...
Now listen, folks, treat it that way. And same thing, if you need to go back and get some more coffee or whatever, this is a kind of a pretty informal classroom. But let me pick it up. So I am saying that Sunday is a day of messianic presentation, official offer of himself. Jesus made that happen. The city welcomed him. Why Friday? The answer is Monday and Tuesday, because Jesus, as is his wont, he found a way to drive the people to a decision which would reveal the depth of their seeming commitment. Does that make sense to you? What seemed to be a willingness to submit to him on Sunday, he puts to the test. All right, now very quickly. When I say that, I'm only talking to myself. Keep going here. Tuesday night, something happens. It is unspeakably important. I'm not going to get into it. It's quite simple. Tuesday night, Judas sneaks away to the home of a man named Caiaphas. Now, Caiaphas is the high priest. He is the primary villain in the Passion story. And he's a very, very wicked man, we know both from Bible and extra biblical records, and a man of absolute corruption. But he was determined to put Jesus to death by reason of the fact that he was the high priest. And you know, it says in John 11, referring to Caiaphas, he was the high priest that year. And when you read that, you're saying to yourself, well, that doesn't make any sense. The high priest, that was an office for life. Oh, no, not under Rome. Under Rome, you had to buy it year by year. And he had been high priest for 18 years. And so Caiaphas, now Caiaphas has a priestly villa in the walled city. That's where the priest lives, whoever he is, but he's lived there for years, and his father-in-law before him. So, but he also has a private home. And that private home is on the next large hill to the south of Jerusalem. Never been a part of Jerusalem, big valley in between, but on the hill to the south of Jerusalem, which is to this day referred to, I mean, its official name is the Hill of Evil Counsel. And the reason it's called that is because that's where Judas went to make the bargain. Does that make sense to you? So Judas goes out Tuesday night, and you know something? You got to understand, I mean, just one little wrinkle that I think helps here is that Judas is the only one of the 12 who is a Judean. The others were all Galileans, and so his family was close by. And so you can imagine that he was a student of a rabbi, and so he had attached himself to that rabbi, Jesus, and so he spent most of his time, but he's there in town, and it would not be hard for him to say, whatever, I'm going to go check on the folks. And so Judas sneaks away, as it were, from Bethany on Tuesday night. He goes down to the home of Caiaphas. Now, I want you to see something, and this is most explicit in Matthew 26, because Matthew 26 says explicitly that it was 2 days before the Passover. That's Tuesday night. And notice verse 3. The chief priests, scribes, and elders. Folks, that ought to draw you up short. Chief priests, that's the Sadducees. The scribes, that's the Pharisees. They hate each other. They have found common cause. All right? And the elders of the people assembled at the palace of the high priest. It actually means the villa, the personal home. And they plotted to take Jesus. But this is what I want you to see. Tuesday night, they are saying, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar. So now you know that Jesus dies on the high day of the feast. And yet on Tuesday night, it's explicit here and in Mark as well. On Tuesday night, the Sanhedrinists are throwing their hands in the air and say, we got to be rid of this guy, but not during the feast. And yet he dies on the feast day. How'd that happen? What's the answer? Judas. Because what happens is Judas comes. Now, I'm not going to get into this at all, but in a very interesting and instructive literary strategy, if you don't mind, both Mark and Matthew at this point tell us the story of that feast that happened last Saturday night. John makes it clear that it happened on Saturday night. They tell the story here, not as if it happened on Tuesday, because they make it a flashback, but they tell the story of the anointing and the rebuke, because they want you to understand that it was that innocent, gentle rebuke of the entire crowd on Saturday night that Judas, because of his sin, took so personally. And it had worked in, Satan had used that for 3 or 4 days. And now Judas puts feet to his anger. And he goes down, and what's this? One of the 12, here in verse 14, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests, and he said, what are you to give me? And they gave him 30 pieces of silver, and from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. So I want you to see that it's on Tuesday night that Judas makes the bargain. Now, there is a lot of confusion, and I'm going to say it's crippling confusion. You've got to disabuse your head of this notion about what Judas was hired to do. He was not hired to identify Jesus. It's crazy to think about, because Jesus had ridden into this. There was no set of human features more familiar to everybody in Jerusalem than the face of Jesus, except for one crowd. One crowd who was very important to the drama that's about to unfold, who would not have been able to recognize Jesus. And who's that? The soldiers. The reason people think the Sanhedrinists hired Judas to identify Jesus is the kiss. The kiss is for the soldiers. That makes sense to you? And Luke is absolutely explicit. I want you to see this. This really colors what's going to happen here. In Luke, he's telling the same story. He doesn't include the, I don't know what I did. Luke 22 and verse 6. He tells us the same story, but he says this. This is the same story, but then it says this. Judas went down. Watch this. So he promised and sought opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of the multitude. That's what he was hired to do, because, again, Jesus was a strategic genius, and he ordered his steps in such a way that he was never without the protection of the crowd, whether at the private residence down there in Bethany or the crowds and so on. And that's what frustrated Jesus' enemies. And they want to kill him, but there's going to be an uproar. Wait, now, 2 things, understand. Number one, the idea is not that Judas is going to follow Jesus around, and if he sees Jesus off by himself, he's going to, text on an iPhone or something. They know the next time Jesus is going to be in the absence of the multitude. That's the Passover. On Thursday night, the Passover has to be taken indoors, and there can't be more than 20 or fewer than 10 worshiping on each lamb or feasting on each lamb. And so Judas knows that the next time Jesus will be in the absence of the multitude will be on Passover night. The only thing is, he has no idea where Passover will be. And that's what Judas is hired to do. I want you to take that with you. Does that make sense? Now, the other thing to say is this, that the fact that Jesus' enemies, once they get sin is always some sort of confluence between desire and opportunity, right? Sin is always happens when you have this wicked confluence of longing and opportunity. And they wanted Jesus dead. But they just couldn't do it. And as soon as the opportunity suggests itself, Judas walks in and says, I can make this happen. They go for it. The fact that they did, in fact, pursue this wicked plot, you got to understand that everybody's career, if not their lives, are at stake. Everybody's. Because if this explodes, like, listen, Jesus' enemies, both Jewish and Roman, have Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday ringing in their ears. They have every reason to believe that when the city hears that they're moving against this one whom they welcome as king, there's going to be a huge riot. If there's a riot, and a riot of almost unimaginable dimensions, because this city is swollen to several times its normal size, and the Romans are going to have to bring in troops, and heads are going to roll from top to bottom. And yet they go through with it. It's a function of their Satan-generated anger. They are absolutely glow-in-the-dark, purple, angry with Jesus. So angry that they pursue this. But at any rate, now, here's the big issue. You have to understand that given the dynamics that we've just explored and so on, the plan is this, and this is so important, what we're going to talk about in just a moment. The plan is to get Jesus arrested, tried, sentenced, and on his way to execution before the city wakes up. It has to be done under cover of night. Because, again, I'm going to say they got every reason to believe that this city is going to riot on behalf of their savior, their champion. That makes sense? All right, so that's Tuesday night. Now, I'm going to mention two things very quickly. One, and this is a bit of a timeout, and I have no idea. I just cherish the opportunity to be with you. I have the greatest regard for you and your pastoral leadership and all of its parts and so on. But I'm just going to go on the record and say I know that there is a lot of debate as to the specific day on which Jesus was crucified. Was it Thursday? Was it Friday? Are the two big ones? I'm not going to get into it. I will do this. I give you I give you in the notes, I'm going to jump down here. I don't know how else to do it. Could have pulled this up earlier. But as an appendix, I give you a 2-page chart on the various ideas as to did Jesus die on Thursday. Look, I'm going to be very quick here. And this is an intramural, fraternal discussion. There's no question of this guy believes the Bible, that guy doesn't, okay? There's a legitimate issue here. And I'm just going to say, as simply as I know how, every indication in the scriptures, and they're powerful indications in the gospel record, is that Jesus died on Friday. There really would be no question except for what? 3 days and 3 nights. That's the fly in the ointment, and it's a legitimate concern. How can he be 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb? Now, that's Matthew 12:40. Matthew 12:40 is the only time Jesus says, he uses the sign of Jonah elsewhere, but the only time he says, as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, so the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth. So, but it's in the Bible. And I give you a lot of notes on that. But one of the notes that I think is particularly helpful, and it's right at the end, what I try and do is give you the various positions and then the arguments for them. But down at the bottom of the page, the second page, and you don't have to worry about it, but I have this, that there is a very instructive citation from the Jewish literature, the Talmud. This is the Mishnah, and the section of the Talmud. And it is a first-century rabbi. Now, it wasn't written down until the 3rd century, but it was a first-century rabbi who is remembered to be talking about the 3 days and 3 nights of Jonah's experience. And he says this, and I think it's helpful. He says, this is Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah and so on, and he says this, a day, well, that won't work very well. He says, right here, a day and night are an onah. Now, it just means a unit, a portion. And then he says, the portion of an onah is as the whole of it. So he makes what he is saying is, when we say 3 days, you're thinking 72 hours. It's really impossible to get 72 hours because then you got to go to Wednesday and Jesus rises on Saturday night, and so that doesn't work very well. So, but at any rate, it's a legitimate issue. I've done my homework. I am absolutely convinced. I'm convinced that he died on Friday. This is the standard position. There are those who, out of the 3 days and 3 nights, develop a very careful set of arguments for Thursday. I respect them. That's what I was taught at Central. That's what Gordy Lovick taught me at Central. He had gone to Grace Seminary in Winona, and there was a couple of guys down there who believed in a Thursday. And for the first several years I taught Life of Christ, I taught Thursday. Well, that's not neither here nor there. I'm just saying it's a respected position. I understand it. Everything about our notes here, I'm working with Friday, and I'm doing it with very honestly. I think that's what happened. Now, second thing to say is this, that if you go with as a matter of fact, here, if you go, which I think we should, with a Friday crucifixion and a Sunday triumphal entry, watch this. So I'm going to go back here. No, here. All right, well, I don't know how soon I've got it here. The point is that if you go with a Sunday triumphal entry and a Friday crucifixion, Wednesday is a silent day. And there are those who are off put by that. My blessed teacher, Harold Honer, was off put by that. And he actually moved the triumphal entry to Monday. Now, everything goes south for me, and it won't work at all. And I did 2 or 3 different papers for him, and we went round and round on this, and neither of us convinced the other. But nonetheless, and I told him, whoever heard of Palm Monday, that's not working for me. How about you? But there may be even more significant arguments on the other hand. But my point is simply this, that I think Wednesday is hugely important. And I give that to you here on the notes. So let me get through Monday and Tuesday. Here are our days, and Wednesday here is a silent day. But here's the thing. It was only late on Tuesday. The Bible is explicit that on Tuesday night they were throwing their hands and saying, can't be done, and yet it's going to happen on Thursday evening. There is a mammoth amount of logistical preparation that has to be made for the plot that unfolds on Thursday night. First of all, a whole cohort, John is explicit, John 18, verse 6, Judas came with a cohort, it's a formal term, and I don't know that it's the entire 600 men, but he had, and it says, he came with a cohort of soldiers with armor, weapons, and lantern. Folks, try and imagine this. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. But what's going to happen is the Sanhedrinists are going to make the case to Pilate that Jesus is a seditionist. He is a pretender king. He is mounting a rebellion. The Roman soldiers have been schooled. I don't know where they were from. They didn't speak the language, but before they were assigned this particular fortress, before they were given that assignment, they were schooled in what a Jewish rebellion looks like, and it's ugly. The Romans, their working principle was, you rebel against us, and we're going to put it down in hours, maybe days, but probably we're going to bring such overwhelming force, and we don't worry about collateral damage. We celebrate collateral damage. The blood's going to run for months. But the point, that's what the Roman policy was. The one place where they had more rebellions than any other place was in Israel, and it always took them 2 or 3 years to put it down. Because Israel, I like to say, is like one big, those of you who've been there can concur, like one big paintball arcade. It's just made for guerrilla warfare. And the Jews were champions at it, and the Romans know nothing but overwhelming force, And so my point is that this is serious business. And what happened was, some soldier, and again, you don't just knock on the door of the Fortress Antonia. The Fortress Antonia is that huge fort that Herod built on the northwest corner of the temple. But you don't just knock on the door and say, quick, I need 600. There's going to have to be some sort of official mandate that goes out, and the soldiers are going to make themselves ready and so on. And they're going out to arrest a Jewish seditionist and his militia band in their mind. And they're ready, they're on high alert. They are ready for warfare, because that's exactly what, it happens again and again. The last one was in 6 AD. It was a man named Judas from Galilee. It took him 2 years to put it down. And first thing he did was capture the huge Roman armory up at Sepphoris. Now he's got all the armament and so on. And any parallels come to mind, leave it alone. But the point is, I come back to it. It's going to take work. It's going to take time to get all that soldiery in place. But then they're going to take and try him before the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night. This is a culture where the sun goes down, you go down. These are 70 old guys. They don't get around so well. They live all over the land. You can't get a message from there to here to there any faster than you can get a person from here to there. So you're going to have to get all these men to alert to the fact that you got to gather in the middle of the night in the priestly villa there in the walled city and so on. And then, after they finally get Jesus to acknowledge he is a king, they're going to take him to Pilate at 4:30 in the morning. And Pilate, because they're sensitive, are going to bring his whole judicial apparatus out and park it out on a gate on the western side of the city. So you see what I'm saying? You've got the soldiery, you've got the Sanhedrin, you've got Pilate's judicial apparatus. Yeah, I think you need Wednesday to make this make any sense. I've told you before, folks, honest to goodness, this is a thing with me. This is real history, and it's got to be coherent. You can't just pretend. So I think Wednesday is really valuable. That's my point. So Wednesday's a busy day. Now, I think there's one other thing that happened on Wednesday, and it's hugely important, and that is this is in the what I think. But let me go back to this one. I think Jesus probably used this time to arrange for the upper room. Now, I want to go there quickly, but watch this. I like to think of Thursday. So we've talked about these. Messianic presentation, triumphal entry. Given Sunday, why Friday, Monday, Tuesday, proclamation. Makes the truth concerning himself, demands a decision. Right? Does that make sense? Tuesday night, we got to kill this guy. Can't do it during the feast. Judas shows up. We can do it. Okay, the plot begins to be put in place all day Wednesday. Everything's being ready. Thursday, I like to think of as a day of messianic preparation. And it is twice a day of preparation. First of all, in the upper room, as Jesus prepares his disciples with this teaching, right? And then in Gethsemane, as Jesus prepares his own soul spirit. Now, I'll come to both of those, but let me just go quickly, and I'm going to shortchange this. The place Jesus takes his disciples is a villa. It has a large upper room furnished for a feast. Now, I won't get into it, but this is the western side of Jerusalem. I think we can stand in the airspace. I do a lot of this when we're in Israel. A lot of it's, okay, the building's, been through. It's George Washington's hatchet. You know that story about the guy who saw the sign for George Washington's hatchet. Is this really the hatchet? Oh, yeah, it's the hatchet. It's had 7 new heads and 6 new handles, but it's the same hatchet, So we get over there and we stand in this or that building and we say, okay, it's been destroyed and rebuilt 100 times, but this is the airspace. I think we can stand there. Now, I'm going to take you to John chapter 12, and this is a little bit anachronistic, but it's very important. And I think this is as good a time as any to do it. So let me take you to John chapter 12, and there is a moment, and let me tell you why I'm doing this. Folks, one of the dynamics of the passion narrative that is absolutely, unmistakably obvious, but is sometimes hard on people. And it's a dynamic, I want to get very serious with you, it's a dynamic that it's bottomlessly important that we embrace it, that we acknowledge it. And that is simply this, that as the cross drew near, it absolutely terrorized Jesus. Now, it wasn't the physical sufferings. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It was the prospect of being made sin for you and me. And we're going to talk about that when we get there tomorrow. But the fact is that Jesus was terrorized by the cross. And I've had people get very upset with me. I was in Siberia, and there was a whole group of student pastors, and it was a situation where I had a very, very poor translator. So they're getting all excited. I have no idea what they want to get up and walk out on me and throw things at me and so on. And I had no idea what was going on, and I finally realized. But they said, you're making Jesus a coward. If you say he was terrorized, you're making him a coward. No, if he had turned back, he'd have been a coward. If he hadn't been terrorized by what he knew was going to be the most unimaginable, awful suffering as the Father disfellowshipped the Son, if he hadn't been terrorized by that, he'd have been insane, you know what I'm saying? And I think it comes through here, because in John chapter 12, this is all I want you to see. It's one of the most noble, and I think this incident ought to really color what we're going to talk about today, and then tomorrow morning. And this is on Tuesday of the Passion Week. It's in all that excitement where Jesus is teaching and taking on all comers and so on. And by the way, I should say this. Matthew says specifically that during that day when he is taking on, you remember everybody coming and trying to catch him in his words and so on, Matthew is explicit that he was healing people who came to him. Now that puts a little different spin on it, doesn't it? That here they are. Let me just see if I can find that, because it's going to be Matthew 21. No, it's later than that. Just watch this. This is the cleansing. All right, here it is. They're coming to him, and I hope I can find it. These are the. In my head, I'm not. Look at there, by the way, in the purple. When the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking to them. They sought to lay hands on him. They feared the multitudes again and again. All right, so I'm not finding. If somebody finds that, let me know. But it's explicit, and I'm pretty sure it's in Matthew, but I'm not sure. But I came across that not too long ago, and I thought, well, no, wait a minute, that puts a different spin on things. Here his enemies are trying to catch him in his words, and in between those attempts, somebody comes and he heals the person walks away healed. That seemed to get your attention. Well, at any rate, I lost my way. John chapter 12. So this is Tuesday, and only John tells us this, and some people came and wanted to see Jesus, and Jesus began to speak to them about dying. And notice what he says in verse 23. This is Tuesday. He says, the hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. And then he says, most surely I say, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground, dies, it remains alone. Now, I'm convinced that he is really encouraging his own soul spirit. He's going to go on and make that point to you and me. But the fact is, he's reminding himself. Because as he contemplates this reality, that there has to be death in order for there to be fruit, as you have this strange and kind of stunning verse in verse 27 where it says, now my soul is troubled. And what seems to be happening here is that, I was like say, it's almost like a Shakespearean soliloquy where Jesus steps to the front of the stage and begins to address the heavens. And I picture Jesus in the midst of this, talking about his death and its time and so on. And I picture him maybe clutching his chest and staggering a bit and say, my soul is troubled. And then he says, what shall I pray? Shall I say, Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this purpose that I came to this hour. Therefore he prays, Father, glorify your name. Now listen, there is no more noble moment in all the scriptures for Jesus to face the terror of what he is about to endure and to momentarily consider, should I say, deliver me, and then to back up and say, no, it was for this purpose that I came to this hour. And so now he looks to the heavens and says, Father, you be glorified. I don't know what heartache, what exigency has or might assault your life, but this is the model. This is the prayer. Father, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. All I'm asking is you be glorified. And listen, this is real. This is a real moment of interaction between the Father and Son. I know that God orders history, but God, and there is that about the way God runs the human universe, just as there is with the moral universe, just as there is with regard to the person about what we can't fully understand. But the fact is that God, this is real. And when Jesus in that moment addresses his Father, his heart is so tender to that of his Son that the Father breaks protocol and speaks out loud. Now Jesus says for our sake, because it was so important, but the Father speaks out loud and he makes this promise. I have glorified it and will glorify it again. Now folks, that's the promise Jesus is going to take to the cross. He is going to rest in his Father's promise that he is going to be glorified through this. Does that make sense to you? Now, I'm just going to ask you to file that remarkable moment away where Jesus staggers and says, what shall I pray? No, it's for this purpose. Father, glorify your name. And then the Father promised, I will glorify, I will. All right, that's sort of the backdrop, because now I want to go to Thursday. And there are a lot of notes, stuff in the, we won't have time, but let me, let's talk about the upper room. And I asked Mike, Jack. I don't hear anything, you guys. These things help, but Jack, to help me here. And we're going to do a little thing here on the floor. And so stand up and see us if you have to and so on. I just thought it'd be easiest to see us here. But I'm going to get, now here's my point, that when you think of the Last Supper, you got this Da Vinci thing going on, right? And maybe good art, what do I know, but really bad history, okay? 13 guys all on the far side of the table facing the artist, with the big table and chairs and so on. That's not the way it happened. It says that Jesus, number one, Jesus says to Peter and John on Thursday afternoon, go make ready. They say, where? And he says, go into town, you'll find a man carrying a pitcher of water. Now, I know, and you're going to get mad at me just momentarily because I'm a swell guy, but I know that your mind goes right away to omniscience. Now, that doesn't make any sense, really, as part of the story. In other words, the disciples say, Peter and John say, where do you want? And Jesus says, well, I hadn't thought about that, but give me a minute here. I'm getting some. There'll be a man. No. What's that man doing there? I think Jesus set this up. I think one of the things that happened on Wednesday was maybe Jesus went over to Nicodemus and he said, now, Nicodemus, I need to borrow one of your servants for just a minute. And sure, go over. So he gets over here and he says, there's a woman in town. Her name is Mary. She's the mother of a young man named John Mark. She has a very, very expansive villa. By reason of the protocols of the Passover, she won't be worshiping. She'll be keeping a Passover on another day. And so we can talk about that another time. So I ask her if I can use her upper room. And if it's okay, have her take a man carrying a pitcher of water is genius in its own right. It's the perfect signal because on the one hand, it's very unusual. It's usually women or children. On the other hand, it's not like bizarre. People aren't. It's not like a two-headed chicken. People aren't going to stop and point. But there's probably going to be one guy there. So what is Jesus doing? He's keeping the place secret from Judas. If Judas had known the place, he'd have had the soldiers there. And there'd have been no upper room. Does that make sense to you? It's so clever. And the other thing to say is, when Jesus gathered with his disciples and he said, you don't know with what desire I have desired to keep this feast. Remember that? And everybody gets very, very, I always say, celebrate the mundane. I think what he is saying is, I moved heaven and earth to make this happen. And because he was desperate to have this time. Now, Jack. Yep. Not only are my ears bad, my mind's not much better. But, all right, now watch, I can do this without hurting myself. Okay, now you're going to get down right here. So, guys, get where you can see us, right here in my position with your back to me. A little closer. Okay, it's easier for you to move than it is. All right, here we are. All right, now, this is a little shtick I do. I did it in the upper room there. But it's just a fast way to work through some of this. Because here is the dynamic. Number one, it says that it was a large upper room furnished for a feast. That part of Jerusalem has been thoroughly dug for reasons I won't go into deeply, but basically because it was totally destroyed in the Six-Day War, and so it was open, and it was Arab, and they all fled. So, and in the digging at that part of the city, they found three of these expansive villas totally in ruins, and in each one they found what's called a triclinium. And a triclinium was a low, three-sided U-shaped table. And the triclinium was for a feast, and there would be pillows all around the outside. And it would be open on this end. It would be three-sided. It'd be open behind me in order for the servant. There was no servant. Does that make sense to you? And so this is the position. There'd be pillows, and you would just make yourself comfortable. Because most people were right-handed, the assumption would be that you would be sitting in this fashion, and you could sit Indian style, and I used to be able to do that too. But the point is that this is the picture I want you to have. Now, if you allow it, so you got it, there's a table here, it's low. The food has been prepared. It would be kind of you'd take the meat of the lamb that you were given after it was slain, and you'd make it into a stew or a mash of sorts, and then you'd have bowls of that and individual little bread, and you would rip off a piece and so on. And if you might hand a nice piece to a neighbor. Now, you probably wouldn't get up and go around a table and do it. But, all right, so, and I think it's quite recoverable that there was a certain place where the leader of the feast would sit, and it would be second from the end. So in other words, if the open end is there, there's one guy here, then I get to be the big, I get to play the primary part. Then Jesus, and who would this be? This is John the Apostle, who describes himself as the one who leaned on Jesus' breast. Now that's actually a formal title for this position. Who is this? That's Judas. And I am leaning on Judas' breast. That makes sense? It's just the position. He's sitting here. Now, if he wants to speak privately to me, he just leans back. Does that make sense? And that's exactly what happens. So now you take this picture. Number one, notice if you think about the Da Vinci picture, your feet are tucked away. And think about this. It's a horrible faux pas to enter a formal feast room with soiled feet. And this is the latter rains. This is a sloppy time in Jerusalem. And there was a basin. Normally there'd be a basin and a rag and a servant, no servant. And so I think each one of them, as they came in the door, they had to kind of do a gut check and say, well, it's embarrassing to have soiled feet, but I don't want to wash my own feet. I look like a servant. And by the way, this is so important. There is every indication that the disciples themselves were convinced that Jesus was about to establish the kingdom, about to hand out kingdom assignments. And that's why Luke says that there was a dispute that arose over who should be greatest in the kingdom. And that probably had to do with who got to sit closest to Jesus. Because this is what Mary is asking for, that her sons, one on the right and one on the left. It's not a throne. This is the picture. The kingdom is a feast. So the point is, they're scrambling for the chief seats. And so now, so I go back to it. They leave their feet soiled. It's hanging out. So now Jesus gets up, goes and fetches that, does that remarkable. I'd love to talk to you about it. Wonderful, wonderful scene recorded in John 13. But then Jesus comes, and by the way, I like to say, when he gets to Peter, you remember Peter says, no, you're not going to wash my feet. And Jesus says, well, then you have no part with me. Well, then wash my hands and my feet. No, give me a bath. No, you just need me to wash you. And but when Peter says, you're not going to wash my feet, Jesus says this. He says, Peter, what I'm doing you won't understand, but henceforth you will understand. And everybody goes to Acts and how Peter grew and he finally understood. Maybe so. I'm saying again, celebrate the mundane, the story. I think what Jesus is saying is, will you play along? I'm trying to make a point here. I'm going to explain it in a minute, for heaven's sakes. But Peter won't do it, So he finally does sit down and explains it and says, you call me Master and Lord, and so I am. You say, well, for so I am. Now think about this. If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, I always say, how do you finish that at your house? If I washed your feet, how would we normally say? You ought to wash my feet. That's not what Jesus said. We'd stand in a long line to wash his feet. What he said is, you ought to wash one another's feet. That's a whole different story, you know what I'm saying? But at any rate, hugely important. But now, this is what I want you to see. The supper they gathered for the Passover, all right? And they kept the Passover. But once the Passover was ended, Jesus made the stunning announcement, the hand of the betrayer is with me at the table. Now, we know where John was. I think we can be certain where Judas was. The only other guy we can kind of position is Peter, and we know he's across the table somewhere. Because when Jesus says the hand of the betrayer is with me at the table, Peter makes motion to John and says, ask who it is. Now, I think probably John asked privately, and Jesus told him privately. Because if everybody at the table knew, how did Judas get out of the room? You know what I'm saying? But I think only John knew. Now, what kind of guy is this John? He's often pictured as kind of the mousy guy. You ever see pictures of the 12 apostles? All of them will have beards except John. And he's always kind of he's the apostle of love and so on. Well, this guy is the son of thunder. And every time we encounter him, he's either trying to call down fire on a Samaritan village, or he's asking his mother to secure him the best place, or he's tattling on this guy who didn't have a union card. Remember that? There's a guy casting out demons, not one of us. And Jesus said, for heaven's sake. So this guy is a hard-driving dude. But I think the point is, Jesus is here to hold him down. Because I think what happened is, he says, the one to whom I hand a morsel. Now, interestingly enough, and this colors the story dramatically, when Jesus said, The hand of the betrayer is with me at the table. And everybody began to say, who could it be? Is it I? Judas leaned over to Jesus and said, Master, is it I? And Jesus says, absolutely it is. Now, whatever surreptitious hopes he might have had, or whatever degree Judas thought he might be sneaking up on, now it's all gone. And he's having a pretty serious struggle there. He's sitting there, am I going to go through with this? He's on to me. But I got these 30 points. And you got to understand, think about Judas, by the way. Jesus had outsmarted him. Judas had made a bargain to tell the Sanhedrinists where Jesus was going to be for this, and he didn't know. And now he makes his way, and he's sitting here thinking, man, I got 600 soldiers waiting. I got the whole Sanhedrin waiting. It can't happen. I got to get out of here somehow. And now he says, is it I? And Jesus says, it is. And then he hands him, John asks who it is, and Jesus hands the sop. Now listen, sin makes you stupid. And that was an act of fraternity. And I think there may have been 8 or 10 guys around the table, because you're all hoping, Jesus had recently told them that they were going to sit on 12 thrones over the 12 tribes. You know what? Some of those tribes are bigger than others. I don't want Gad or Dan, for heaven's sakes. I want Judah or Ephraim, And so I think when Jesus does, and Judas was the only sophisticate in the crowd. He was Galilean. He was the white-collar guy. He kept the bag. All the others were dirt under their fingernail fishermen and so on. And so Judas was well-respected. And now Jesus hands that sop, and I think maybe 7 or 8 guys thought, nuts, I want Judah, there went Ephraim, But that goodness, that kindness, that special act of fraternity, Satan used to anger. This is what sin does to you. It makes you stunningly stupid. And that act of kindness angers Judas, and so he gets up and makes an excuse and leaves. And meanwhile, Jesus around the table begins to teach. That make sense to you? All right, thank you. Yeah, now watch, give me a pound. I'm going to ask him to get me off the floor. It may take 2 of you, but thank you. I just got no knees, the knees are gone. But I can still get around Israel, I think. But all right, now, I want you to see something, because this is so timely. In John chapter 13, you have the story. John tells the story of the foot washing, but he doesn't tell much about the upper room. But he does say that he talks about announcing the betrayer and so on. But here, this is the verse I want you to see right here. This is Judas, because Judas had made an excuse, and Jesus said, what you do quickly, and so on. And so having received the morsel, the piece of bread, verse 30, Judas went out immediately, and it was night. Now again, you can't begin the Passover feast until after sundown. So sundown, maybe 7:30ish, it's a long feast. It's not a meal, it's a feast. It includes a meal, it's a feast, teaching, and so on. So it's probably, I don't know, I think it's fair to say it's getting on to 11:30 at night. And Judas leaves in the middle of the night. But this is what I want you to see. So Judas left, and then listen to this. When he had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified. All right, now listen. He has in mind that promise that the Father gave to him. And what Jesus is saying is, the game is afoot. The curtain is going up. It's happening. Judas, it's interesting that in telling this story, rehearsing this in 1 Corinthians 11, the passage we read with the Lord's Supper month by month. Paul says that on the night when he was betrayed, Jesus took bread. The Greek says this, on the night while he was being betrayed, because Judas has gone to fetch the Sanhedrinists. Now, Jesus is going to introduce the Lord's Supper. How I'd love to talk to you about it. It is the symbol of the new covenant. You and I ought to wallow consciously in the blessedness of the new covenant, and we are celebrating that. But at any rate, Jesus begins to preach. Now, John 14 and 15 and 16 are often called the upper room discourse. Not really. John 14 is, because Jesus began, and I'm not going to go through it, but again, suffice it to say, I mentioned before that Thursday is a day of preparation. First of all, he is preparing his disciples by this marvelous, marvelous series of lessons In John 14, let not your heart be troubled. I go to prepare a place. John 15, I am the vine, you are the branches, you need to abide in me. John 16, it's expedient for you that I go. If I don't come, when I depart, the Comforter will come, and he'll have this ministry of reproving the world and so on. And then in John 17, of course, he's going to pray that magisterial high priestly prayer where your name comes up, the other sheep that are yet to come. So it's a hugely important time. The primary focus is on the coming of the Holy Spirit, which to the Jewish mind is the new covenant, Ezekiel 36. That in the new covenant, I'm going to take your heart of stone, I'm going to give you a heart of flesh, and the Spirit of God will come, and so on. So it's such a blessed, blessed passage, John 14. But watch, I want you to see something. Judas goes, and where is Judas going? And we're going to use this map quite a bit. I know I have it here. And this is in your notes as an appendix, I think. But here you are at the site of the Last Supper. And there's really no question about this. This is that fortress that I mentioned where the legion, not the legion, the cohort. They don't have a legion, but they have a cohort, maybe two. But the soldiers are stationed. The larger base of soldiers down at Caesarea Maritima. That's where the headquarters, the Roman headquarters is down there on the Mediterranean. But Jerusalem, hugely important city, has its own soldier battalion there. And so Judas is going to have to leave here and make his way all the way up here to fetch the soldiers. Meanwhile, the alert's probably going to go out to the Sanhedrinists as well, who are closer by. Now, here's the point. Jesus is in the upper room. He begins to preach, John 14. But look at this, John 14 and verse 31. So I'm going to just scroll down all of this marvelous interchange and so on. But look at John 14, 31. He says, arise, let us go from here. So it's not all in the upper room. He teaches John 14, but then he says to the 11, we need to get out of here. Why? Well, again, because he knows how much time it's going to take. He's not trying to escape, but he wants the time. He desperately wants the time to instruct his disciples, and he desperately needs that season of prayer. I'm going to come to it in just a moment. So here's the point. Now, let me ask you this. So Judas goes up here, alerts, I got him, I know where he is, follow me. Where's he going to take him? He's going to take him to the upper room. When he gets there, he's going to find it empty because Jesus has made his way. Now, Jerusalem's a gated city, so you have to find a gate, and the only gate available to him was this gate down here in the south. It's kind of not particularly pleasant, but it's called the Dung, D-U-N-G gate. The reason is because the gates always were named for where they took you. And way down here to the south, at the union of three valleys, was the garbage dump. And that's where he took the dump. But anyway, he's going to go out this gate. Then he's going to make his way all the way up the Kidron Valley to this garden. It's a farm. It's an olive pressing farm. And listen, John, who is so carefully supplementing the Gospels, he's filling in details to make the story so coherent. And John says, he tells the story of Jesus. So as he goes, Jesus preaches John 15, John 16. He's going down the side of the Kidron Valley. And then he stops I think probably, and gathers his disciples about him and prays this marvelous prayer of John 17. And now you have in John 18, it says this, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron. Now here's a curious thing about the brook Kidron. The brook Kidron, this is the, I can't change it. This is the Kidron Valley. The temple sits right here. You know, when you think of the temple, you think of like a cathedral. It's a slaughterhouse. Thousands and thousands of animals. Now at Passover, tens of thousands of animals, lambs have been slain. There were the most careful steps taken to ensure cleanliness, hygiene. And a lot of that, the priests would be doing the slaying, and the Levites, remember the rest of the Levitical family, were hustling about, scooping up anything that could be burned or buried. And they would immediately cart that off down by the Dead Sea to the area called the Jeshimon, and they would do that. They'd burn or bury it. On the other hand, there were these huge just huge cisterns, and this water system bringing water from Bethlehem 5 miles away, and this massive amounts of water that were stored in these cisterns, and they had these channels and these aqueducts and so on. And then these Levites, that would be just a regular, you'd have donkeys. And those donkeys could carry, I don't know, 7, 8 goat bags. They'd take goat skins and tie them off and turn them inside out and top. Those were water bags. And so they were just constantly hauling water up there, and then that water was used to be washed everything away. Everything was kept pure through this whole day. Well, and they had all sorts of cisterns, but here's an interesting thing. All of the refuse from the Temple Mount here was dumped into the Kidron Valley. There was a brook there. And that brook, interestingly enough, makes it all the way down about 15 miles and dumps into the Dead Sea. Because you see, the Dead Sea was the divinely provided sewage treatment plant for the temple. Because you got that Dead Sea with 10 times the normal concentration of salt, and everything was just totally wiped away. And so on earlier that day, Peter and John had gone to the temple along with tens of thousands of other Jews, and they'd had the lamb slain. And all that blood is going to be, so when it says in John 18 that Jesus stepped across the brook Kidron, I think it's fair to say that brook was running red with the blood of all of those lambs, all of which is a picture of what he's about to endure in John. But then he says this is the verse I had in mind, verse 2, where there was a garden. And then he says, and Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus often met there. Now, when you get to Jerusalem, everybody goes to Gethsemane. You got to go to Gethsemane. Amen and amen. But what most people don't see, and I think to their disadvantage, they don't see the cave, because part of and you got to leave the garden, you got to go down a lane and down some stairs and so on. But low on the hill, which is the garden, that's where the olive trees were, where Jesus is going to go to pray, there is a cave. It's part of the same. Matter of fact, the olive press is in the cave. The olive press for that farm. And evidently, Jesus, when he was in Jerusalem alone or with others, whoever owned the garden gave him permission. There would have been a stone fence, and there would have been thorns and so on, but he gave him permission. So he would often stay in that little cave, and you can go to that cave today and sit there and realize that's where Jesus would often stay. But now again, it's the middle of the night, and these disciples are tired. And so Jesus takes them, walks them across, and what John is saying here is that when Judas got back to the upper room and realized it was empty, the city is crowded beyond what we can imagine. There's only one place where 12 guys, Jesus and the 11, could go. It's where they went regularly. So I think he said, don't worry, guys, and he follows the same route. So Judas now takes the soldiers and the Sanhedrists. Jesus, meanwhile, goes into that cave. He begs his disciples, please watch and pray. This is what he says, my soul is heavy in me unto death. Now, very quickly, what happens, he's going to take 3 of the disciples, and he's going to leave that cave and go up into the garden itself, and there 3 times he's going to beg the Father, if there be any way, let this cup pass from me. Folks, let me just say 2 things. Number 1, I don't think you can really appreciate Golgotha unless you start with Gethsemane. And I'll tell you why. Artists of every age and every medium can very effectively describe physical suffering. How do you describe bottomless spiritual suffering? How do you, and I don't think that the most important element of the story with regard to understanding the depth of Jesus' suffering is Gethsemane. And that's why I like to start with that passage in John 12, where he, for a moment, entertains the idea, what shall I pray? Deliver me? No, it was for this purpose that I came to this hour. It's significant that what Jesus refuses to pray on Tuesday, he prays 3 times with absolute earnestness. And again, he never stops there. He goes on to say, not my will, but thine be done. And having prayed 3 times, if there be any way, and if there's anything this teaches us, there is no other way. But having prayed, if there be any way, let this cup pass from me. You'll remember perhaps that as they, well, this is what happens. Jesus prays 3 times. Let me just say this. Luke 22 gives us 2 other insights. And I know there's a text critical issue here. I've done my homework. Believe me, this is in the Bible. Number 1, it says that Jesus sweat great drops of blood. You know what? There are a couple of events in Jesus' life which make it clear that he was quite a man. I mean, just physically. Now, you would expect, and I think he was a stone mason. He'd been slugging those big stones around and swinging that 9-pounder, for his whole life and so on. But the fact that he could withstand a 40-day fast, but now the fact that the reality that he could endure the kind of emotional angst that is reflected when this physical situation, this physical condition where your blood is forced into the, what do I want to say, not the blood vessel, but the little ones, but capillaries. I want to say ancillaries. That doesn't make any sense here. But my point is that this is, it's stunning. But the other thing, it says that the Father sent angels. Now, I want you to ponder this. The only other time that the Father looked down and saw his Son at such a physical exigency, so entirely at the edge of his abilities, that he sent angels to care for him, was after a 40-day fast. And I'll insist, I don't think those angels can't do miracles. They would do for Jesus what you and I would do for him. And it took him several weeks, I think. Now, the only other time the disciples are asleep, Jesus is alone, the 3 have fallen asleep. I don't know what the angels did. I picture maybe that just they bent over and helped him off the ground, and it was with angelic help that Jesus staggered from the garden. But is it not instructive, folks, that now it's not by reason of a 40-day fast that the Father did. It's by reason of Jesus' contemplation of what he's about to endure for you and for me. So I'm saying that this season where Jesus, understanding what's about to happen, begs the Father. Now, it's so blessed that after Jesus, he goes and wakes the 3, then he goes and fetches the other 8, and he would have made his way, and you can stand, it's a bustling place today, cars and cabs and hawkers and so on, but you can stand exactly at the place, because there's no real question as to where Gethsemane was, and just walk down the hill, and that's where Jesus was arrested. So now, Jesus comes down with the 11, and they look up to the north, to the south, and here comes, and they see this cohort. It's called a multitude. Judas has a multitude of soldiers, and they're fully armed. They're in rank, and they're files, and they've got armors and weapons and lanterns, and this is a pretty imposing sight. And you're one of the disciples. What's going on here? And then you recognize, wait, Judas is with them. What's that all about? And then you see all these famous saying here. What's going on here? They had no idea, folks. I'm convinced that they were confident that Jesus was about to establish the kingdom. And they were confused by all of this talk about going away and so on. But not. So at any rate, Jesus is arrested there in the Kidron Valley. And I want to talk about one other thing. Let me see here. So Jesus is arrested and deserted by his disciples. Now, I want you to catch something here that is almost always overlooked. And you know what? I'm going to confess something to you. When I say that, and it's a sweet providence of God, I graduated from Central. I proved my absolute inefficacy as a pastor for about a year and a half. It was pretty frustrating. And I was invited to join the faculty at Pillsbury. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven, for heaven's sakes. They were going to pay me $3,500 for a year. But that's another story. It was great. One of those things you wouldn't trade for $1 million. You wouldn't do it again for the same, But the point is that the second semester I was there, the chairman of the Bible department, I'm just right out of seminary, and he said, next semester you're going to teach Life of Christ. I never read a book on Life of Christ. I knew nothing about it. I was totally intimidated, but I'm thankful for it. And I've taught, now I'd like to find the first 7 or 8 years and give them their money back. I'll tell you that right now. But the point is that I've taught, and by the way, that Bible chair department was Larry Pettigrew, who is, was my dean in Cary, North Carolina for all these years. But But my point is this, that I look back and there are elements of the story that I missed for so long. And one of those elements that really is staggering and very important that is the drama of this arrest, because these soldiers, I before, are on high alert. They've been told there is a Jewish sedition afoot and there is a pretender king. And they know exactly what that looks like. He's always going to gather around himself a militia, and it's going to be ugly. Does that make sense to you? So now they come out, they're on the alert, and Jesus had prayed on his way down the hill. A part of that prayer, he had said, I have kept those you've given me, protect them. And now Jesus, what happens is this. They come down, they're on high alert. Jesus steps forward and says, who is it that you are seeking? Well, in the melee, first of all, Peter, and I never finished this thought, by the way, having prayed 3 times, let this cup pass from me. When Peter takes that little dagger, listen, every family had a little family dagger you'd use only once a year to slay the Passover lamb. And because Peter and John were given this responsibility, they brought it along. You remember in the upper room, they said, we got these 2 swords. So it's a little kind of ceremonial dagger. It's very sharp because it has to be very humane. So he draws that out and whips and cuts off the ear of one of the high priest's servants. And Jesus, it's interesting the way John tells the story. Jesus says, hold it, wait a minute. Don't get, because you can imagine they're about to slaughter the Roman soldiers. And he touches that man's ear, takes his hand away, fully restored. Now, I always say, to me, that's the second most amazing thing that happened that night. The most amazing thing being that the rest of the soldiers went on the arrest. You know, guys, you take it from here. I'm going home. You know what I'm saying? But nonetheless, the point is that Jesus steps forward and he says, who is it you are looking for? And maybe the leader of the battalion or whatever takes out and reads it, and there's an official, the Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua ben Yosef of Nazareth. And Jesus says, I am he. Don't worry about these guys, let them go. Jesus takes careful steps. And it's interesting that John says, and I know you're going to be disappointed in me here, but John says that when Jesus did that, the Roman soldiers fell back over themselves. And there are a lot of kind of, I don't know, you know, like one idea is that Jesus, when he said, I am he, some burst of theophanic glory, you know, exploded from his person or something. I don't think that's in the narrative, you know what I'm saying? I think the point is that those Roman soldiers, they were ready to attack. And they figured they were just about to break into it. And when Jesus said, I'm here, they all, okay. I think it's kind of the Keystone Cops make an arrest, you know what I'm saying? They all kind of stumble over each other. I think that's all that's at stake. But the point is that the disciples desert Jesus, and Jesus is, in fact, arrested. By now, it's got to be close to midnight. And so I have here, I'm going to do this very quickly in order to make it work for tomorrow. Jesus is going to be taken, first of all, all right, let me do this very quickly. I'm shifting gears. We're going to Friday. And I've always referred to, and in your notes, I refer to Friday as a day of messianic perfection. I have in mind the cross. And Jesus had said back there in Luke 13, I'm going to walk today and tomorrow, and on the 3rd day I'll be perfected. And what he's talking about is it is finished. On the other hand, first of all, it's a day of messianic prosecution. And there is a series of hearings and trials that I want to spend some time with. And I'll just summarize it this way. First of all, there are 3 Jewish hearings. Now, I'm a little careful, not all the time, but they really shouldn't be called trials. A trial is where the court gathers to determine guilt or innocence and to assign punishment. This is an attempt to come up with an indictment. I have told you before that Jesus, all throughout his ministry, made the claim to be Messiah, God come in the flesh. Remember we talked about that last night? That was his twofold claim. On the other hand, it is so instructive that Jesus, because he was wise as a serpent, and because he knew that if he openly laid claim, if he used the term Messiah of himself, Messiah means a lot of things. I could trace the history of the title for you, but above all, to the Jewish mind, it means king. And Rome will not stand for kings. And so this is why, as I say, when they came to him and said on Tuesday and said, the Sadducees, what right do you have to take over and he didn't say, well, I'm Messiah. He said, he took him to the John argument. Remember that, the John the Baptist argument, and sure enough, he was always so careful. And he never, ever uses the word Messiah of himself in his public ministry. There's one time early on, now during the trials and so on, yes, but there's only one time when he does, and he doesn't say it explicitly, but it's the woman at the well. And she says, I know that the Jews believe Messiah, and he says the one talking to is he. Other than that, he never takes the title Messiah. On the other hand, how does he claim to be Messiah? He's clever. And so what he does is he takes to himself all of these Old Testament pictures and words and so on that every Jew will understand is Messiah, but will be innocuous. In other words, they won't be able to use it to accuse him to the Romans. Does that make sense to you? It's exactly what's going on. It's a huge dynamic. What is Jesus' favorite title for himself in the Gospels? What is it? Son of Man. 81 times. Where does that come from? Daniel 7. For beasts, the Ancient of Days takes his throne and calls one like unto a son of man, and that son of man is dispatched to be the Messiah, to establish a fifth world kingdom. Now my point is, when Jesus claims to be the Son of Man, when he uses the title of himself, every Jewish person understands that he is saying, I am your Messiah. I am the fulfillment of Daniel 7. On the other hand, if the Jewish leaders go to Pilate and say, you got trouble, this man claims to be the Son of Man, what's he going to say? Me too, aren't we all? What are you talking about, So I'm telling you, it's genius. And everybody acknowledges there's a huge wicked heresy built on this, but the fact that Jesus doesn't claim to be Messiah. He does claim to be Messiah, but he doesn't use the term. Well, that's what has the Sanhedrinists tied in knots, because they have sent their agents to Pilate's agents. They have this huge thing cooked up. They're going to meet Pilate about 4:30 in the morning, but they don't have a credible indictment. Nobody can make the case that Jesus publicly claimed to be Messiah. Does that make sense to you? That's exactly what's got them tied in knots. Now, two things. Number one, this section of Jesus' life is as much attacked as any other, because and we're told, there is this community of scholars, lost, called critical scholars, and what I mean by that is anti-supernaturalistic. They absolutely reject the possibility of the supernatural, so they have to explain the Bible away in all of its parts, and they love to find contradictions. And guess what? The Gospels are their happy hunting grounds, because you got four guys telling the same story. Now, there are no mistakes. There are no inconsistencies. Every one of them can be easily explained and so on, but they love it, and they'll tell us that the one area of Jesus' life which is absolutely, you can't sort it out, it's a mess, they contradict, is the trials. They fit perfectly. But what you have to understand, no one gospel tells us all of the stories. John, there are three stages. I'm not going to walk you through them very quickly. Three stages to the Jewish hearings. The first is recorded only in John, and it was Jesus is being taken to Caiaphas. He's the high priest and thus in charge of the Sanhedrin. But it's going to take a little time, and there in that massive priestly villa, there high on the western hill, there's an old man named Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas and used to be the high priest and have his own quarters, so he went in on the action. So while they're making everything ready, Jesus is brought to Annas. And this is where Annas says, tell me about your teaching. And Jesus said, look, what's going to happen in this hearing is that the Jewish leadership is going to high-handedly violate any number of their own very sacred, very precious, very noble protocols of jurisprudence. They're going to break their own laws again and again. It's an embarrassment. I think we need to talk about it honestly but carefully, but it is a function of their anger. And the first and most important, perhaps, canon of jurisprudence, of criminal, no culture can rise above the integrity of its judicial system. If that doesn't put, get you to shaking just a little, I don't know what. And the judicial system of the Jews is right out of the Old Testament, right out of the theocracy. So and the first principle was, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every matter be established. In other words, the reason we have a Fifth Amendment is because of that reality. You can't interrogate the witness. And so when Annas says to Jesus, tell me about yourself, Jesus says, I always spoke in the marketplaces and the synagogues, ask the people. He's always saying is live by your own standards. Well, there is a security guard, a soldier assigned to Annas and so on because of his status. And he slaps Jesus. Now, another absolute unbreakable protocol of Jewish law is that you can't punish a man until he's proven he's done the crime. And so Jesus says to the man, if I've done wrong, testify, but if not, why would you strike me? Now, again, there's nothing of, I think Jesus just being very honest. He's pointing out to Annas, he's not living, well, nothing comes of that, because now they're ready, and Jesus is taken in, and this is the big one. Now you have and this is in Matthew and Mark, and you have the 70, or most of the 70, they're gathered. It's illegal. It's in the middle of the night. You cannot have a trial between sundown and sunup. That's important because you can't get witnesses. And so they bring all these witnesses, these false witnesses. They can't. By the way, another protocol of Jewish law is, in a capital case, if 2 purported witnesses disagree, the man is immediately released. But none of that's honored, of course. And so they contradict one another. I won't go through it, but the point is that finally Caiaphas, the high priest, who knows he's got a date with Pilate at about 4:30 in the morning, because this has to get done before the city wakes up. So Caiaphas comes up with a strategy. I don't think he had much hope that it would work, but he's desperate. And so he does, in fact, put Jesus under oath. And he says, all he's trying to do, he can't find anybody who can testify. I heard the Nazarene say he is the Messiah. So he says to Jesus, he puts him under oath, and he says, tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? All right, now I want to ask you 2 questions. Of those 2 claims, to be Christ, the Messiah, to be God come in the flesh, which of those 2 is most intrinsically offensive to a thinking Jewish mind? What is the most horrific? Son of God, right? That's blasphemy. But of those 2, which is what they're after right now? See the point? This is not, they want to hear him say he's Messiah. And so, but they know that his claims are, he called Christ, the Son of the living God. So he says, all right, I'm going to put you under oath. This is what you've said again and again. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. But tell us plainly, are you the Christ? And Jesus says, I am. It is exactly as you said. He thinks we got him. So now we got him. And we've got 70 guys who heard him claim to be Messiah. We can go and make the case that he is, in fact, a pretender king, a seditionist. He's a threat to Rome. Now, on the other hand, what they did was in the middle of the night. And Pilate, they know, is not happy to be part of this. And he might just throw the whole thing out because the whole judicial process was entirely wicked, wrong, by their own standards. So they decide that they're going to keep Jesus for a time until the first blush of dawn. The law was you can't have a trial between sundown and sunup. And so they're going to wait until the very first, and I don't mean the sky begins to grow pink. I mean a little gray on the horizon. And they're going to wait for that. And then they'll bring Jesus back in and get him once again to confess the same thing, and now they can take him to Pilate. Does that make sense to you? Only Luke tells this story. Both Matthew and Mark refer to it, but Luke tells the story, and that's exactly what happens. They keep him, and for a time, the soldiers who keep him are making sport with him and buffeting him and blindfolding him and so on. So now, at the first blush of dawn, and that's why I say about 4:30, I've sat up on the roof in the hotel at this season of the year and just waited. You know what else happens, by the way, at the first blush of dawn? I don't mean the pink, I mean just the gray. The roosters start to crow. Now, Jesus is going to be brought back in. No witnesses, nothing. They just say, are you the Christ? Jesus says, I'm not going to answer that. He wants the okay, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? I am. Now he's taken to Pilate. Does that make sense to you? 3 Jewish hearings. First of all, Annas, just trying to get something out of him, and Jesus says, play by your own rules. The big one, no witnesses, finally, tell us plainly, I am. We got you. Put him in hold for a time. Now, one other thing, just to take home with you. It is stunning how much ink Peter gets in this drama, and it's all unhappy ink. But the story is told in great detail. And one of the guys who tells it in the greatest detail is Mark, and that's only Peter. Mark is just writing down what Peter said. So he tells his own story. But Jesus had told him 3 times, you're going to deny me. And now Peter has found his way into the courtyard. He's already twice denied Jesus. And now it's so interesting to put it all together, because if you understand the dynamics and so on, Jesus has been taken off and held in that outbuilding somewhere, maybe a cistern or something. He's being held and abused because they're waiting for the first blush of dawn. Now, as that first blush of dawn approaches, he's brought back, and what else happens at the first blush of dawn? So Peter is warming his hands, and for the 3rd time he takes an oath, and before the words are done from his mouth, it says that the rooster began to crow. And it's not a rooster. That's not the point. Some people say, the point is the time when the rooster crows, the very first morning of and so here's a rooster right there in that courtyard, and he begins to crow, and it says this: Peter remembered the words of the Lord. That's stunning. Those words were only a few hours ago, and he had twice denied Jesus. And somehow his mind, it's stunning. By the way, Peter's going to write an epistle in which he says, I'm writing this epistle to stir up your minds by way of remembrance. Matter of fact, he says, I am writing to, and I'm going to make sure that even though you know, Peter understood that we have a capacity to forget. And so Jesus, anybody. But at any rate, and then the Bible says, Luke says that as he heard the rooster crow, he looked, and Jesus turned and looked at him. How'd they happen to be there? See, Jesus is being hauled back in for that immediately post-dawn full hearing to get him to once again. Meanwhile, Peter is warming his hands and denies. So it really fits together just perfectly. Jesus then is going to be taken to Pilate, and you'll have the Roman trials. Now, this is an awkward place, but we're going to break it here, and we'll pick it up tomorrow morning in Sunday school. I know there will be people, we have to do a little review, but you're the elect, you know what I'm saying? You really understand what's going on. So, but again, it's Friday, and as I say, I just finished with this, that it is going to be, and this is what we're going to talk about in the morning service tomorrow, a day of messianic perfection on the cross. But there's, first of all, this drama of the trials, the prosecution, and 3 Jewish, and then the trial before Pilate. We'll pick it up there in the morning. All right, thank you. A lot of ground to cover, but Rory, Pastor.
I want to thank you all again for coming, and we appreciate your presence. Everything that, all the sessions that Dr. Bookman is doing are all being live streamed and recorded, and so if you can't come tomorrow, those will be available. Just another reminder to those of you who will be here tomorrow or have plans tomorrow, that tomorrow evening is not happening because Dr. Bookman has to fly out in the afternoon. So we will be we'll be having an afternoon thing after the morning worship service. So just bear that in mind. Just want to give you that reminder again. Thank you again for coming. If you didn't get a chance to, there are the narrate or the harmonizations of the gospel of just of the Passion Week back on the table. I printed out a few extra copies of those because Dr. Bookman mentioned it yesterday, so those are available for you as well. And so is the offering plate if you want to give something. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.